Have you ever heard a religious belief and thought, wait, someone definitely just made that up on the spot? Yet somehow, despite sounding bizarre or even illogical, millions of people treat these beliefs with absolute seriousness. That's one of the most fascinating and puzzling aspects of human culture, the ability to hold on tightly to ideas that, from the outside, might look absurd. But when you dig deeper, you realize that these beliefs aren't just about logic. They're tied to emotion, community, and identity. They stick not because they're provable, but because they're powerful. Let's explore how this works by looking at two examples: the sacred cow in India and a modern religious sect in South Korea that continues to follow the authority of a pastor even after his death. At first glance, both might seem strange, but when we look at the cultural roots and psychological mechanisms behind them, they reveal just how resilient human faith can be. The strange power of belief. Here's something to think about. Humans aren't just rational creatures. If we only believed things that made perfect logical sense, religion as we know it wouldn't exist. Instead, belief often thrives in spaces where logic falls short, where people crave meaning, comfort, or a sense of belonging. Once a belief becomes part of a community's shared story, it develops a kind of immunity. It's no longer just an idea, it becomes a symbol of identity. To question it feels like questioning the community itself. That's why some beliefs, no matter how unlikely they seem, can last for centuries. Example 1. The sacred cow in India. Take the sacred cow in India. From an outsider's perspective, it might look puzzling. Cows wander freely through busy streets, sometimes blocking traffic, sometimes even lounging in marketplaces. Killing a cow is considered deeply offensive by millions of Hindus, and beef consumption is restricted or outright banned in many regions. If you've never grown up with this belief, it might sound excessive. Why elevate a farm animal to such spiritual importance? But here's the thing: the sacredness of cows in India isn't random. It has deep historical, cultural, and spiritual roots. In Hinduism, the cow is associated with life and nourishment. For centuries, cows have provided milk, fuel, from dung, labor, and even fertilizer. In a way, the cow has been a lifeline for survival in agrarian communities. Over time, this practical importance evolved into spiritual reverence. The cow came to symbolize motherhood, abundance, and nonviolence. Psychologically, this makes sense. When an animal provides so much for a community, it's natural to develop respect, and that respect can easily transform into something sacred. By protecting cows, communities were also protecting their food security and way of life. The spiritual layer simply reinforced what was already beneficial. So while the idea of worshiping a cow might sound absurd if taken literally, within its cultural and historical context, it reflects deep survival wisdom wrapped in a religious narrative. Example 2. The South Korean sect. Now let's jump to something very different: a religious sect in South Korea, where followers believe that a pastor, even after death, continues to lead them spiritually. From the outside, this can sound almost surreal. Why follow someone who is no longer alive? How can a dead leader still be in charge? But again, if we step into the psychology of faith, it makes more sense. For these followers, the pastor wasn't just a leader. He was a father figure, a prophet, someone who gave them meaning and direction. His teachings shaped their identity and worldview. To let go of that after his death would feel like losing not just a person, but their entire spiritual foundation. There's also a psychological phenomenon at play here. When someone invests deeply in a belief system, especially one tied to a charismatic leader, the belief doesn't just vanish when that leader dies. Instead, the community often doubles down. Death becomes reinterpreted, not as an end, but as proof of the leader's transcendence. Believing that the pastor still rules spiritually allows followers to maintain continuity, stability, and purpose. It avoids the painful chaos of admitting they were wrong or that their guiding figure is gone forever. Why do these beliefs stick? So what's really going on here? Why do beliefs like these, whether about cows or about a deceased pastor, hold such power? First, they provide emotional comfort. Belief offers security in a world full of uncertainty. It tells people what's right, what's wrong, what's sacred, and what's off limits. Second, they create social cohesion. When everyone in a community shares the same belief, it becomes a badge of belonging. Even if the belief sounds strange to outsiders, for insiders, it's a mark of unity. To abandon it would feel like betraying the group. Third, they tap into identity. Religious beliefs often become part of who you are, not just what you think. Questioning them feels like questioning yourself, your family, your ancestors, and your future. That's a powerful barrier against doubt. And finally, there's the survival mechanism. In many cases, these beliefs served practical functions at some point in history, even if that function isn't obvious anymore. Protecting cows supported agriculture. Following a leader, alive or dead, keeps groups organized and resilient. Over time, the original practical reasons may fade, but the belief itself endures, held up by tradition and reinforced by community. The bigger picture. Here's the fascinating takeaway. Whether it's reverence for cows in India or devotion to a deceased pastor in South Korea, these beliefs survive not because they're logical, but because they're meaningful. And meaning in human life often outweighs logic. That's why it's so easy for outsiders to laugh at or dismiss these practices. But for insiders, they're not just beliefs, they're the foundation of their world. They shape identity, morality, and belonging. And that's what makes them so powerful. So the next time you come across a belief that seems made up on the spot, pause for a moment. Instead of just asking, is this true? Ask, what purpose does this serve? Because often the endurance of a belief has less to do with whether it's provable and more to do with how deeply it connects to human needs, for comfort, for community, and for meaning. When you look at some religious practices from the outside, it's easy to shake your head and think, that makes no sense. Why would anyone believe that a statue weeping tears is a miracle? Why would people devote their lives to following a leader who has already passed away? Why would a group in a far-off island build wooden airplanes and bamboo runways, convinced that real planes filled with cargo will land? To a modern, rational mindset, these things seem absurd, almost like plot lines from a strange novel. But here's the key. Inside the community, for the people who live and breathe these practices every day, the beliefs don't feel absurd at all. In fact, they feel deeply meaningful, emotionally satisfying, and socially necessary. So let's slow down and unpack that. Instead of just laughing off unusual rituals, it helps to ask, what do these beliefs actually do for people? Because when you peel back the surface, you start to see that so-called irrational beliefs often serve very rational functions. They create identity, they reduce fear, they connect people, and they help explain the unexplainable. Take the famous example of the cargo cults in the Pacific Islands. During World War II, Western militaries landed on these islands, building airstrips and unloading mountains of supplies, food, clothing, medicine, technology that the islanders had never seen before. Then, just as suddenly, the soldiers left and the flow of goods disappeared. The locals were left wondering, what just happened? Where did all this wealth come from? And why did it stop? Out of that confusion emerged the cargo cults, religious movements where people built imitation runways, crafted wooden control towers, and carved bamboo radios. They believed that if they repeated the rituals of the foreigners, the mysterious cargo would return. Now, from our modern perspective, this might look like a silly misunderstanding, but think about it in context. These communities were trying to make sense of a world completely upended by forces they couldn't control. The rituals gave them hope, order, and a sense of agency. Instead of being powerless, they felt like they had a way to bring abundance back. Was it scientifically accurate? No. But was it psychologically and socially functional? Absolutely. This isn't just a quirk of isolated tribes. If you zoom out, you see the same pattern across human history. Ancient civilizations practiced elaborate rituals to ensure rain, fertility, or victory in battle. From the Aztecs offering sacrifices to appease their gods, to Romans reading omens in bird flights, people have always turned to symbolic actions when facing uncertainty. And here's the interesting part. Even when the rituals themselves didn't cause the rain or the harvest, the shared belief bound people together. It gave them a reason to cooperate, to endure hardship, to trust that their struggles had purpose. Psychologists often talk about the idea of a meaning system. Human beings aren't just rational calculators, we're meaning makers. We need stories that explain why things happen, and we crave frameworks that help us cope with chaos. If life feels random, cruel, and out of control, anxiety skyrockets. But if you believe there's a larger order, whether it's karma, divine will, or ancestral spirits, you suddenly feel less lost. Even suffering can be reframed as part of a bigger plan. That's a powerful psychological shield. Another reason seemingly strange beliefs endure is social cohesion. Think of a religious ritual not as an isolated act, but as a performance shared by a community. When you bow together, chant together, march together, or even build wooden airplanes together, you're reinforcing bonds. The belief becomes a glue holding the group in place. It separates us from them, insiders from outsiders. And let's be honest, belonging is one of the most fundamental human needs. People will endure hardship, ridicule, even persecution if it means staying connected to their group. Anthropologists often describe these rituals as costly signals. The more inconvenient, strange, or difficult a ritual is, the more it demonstrates loyalty. For example, fasting for long periods, walking on fire, or giving up personal wealth. All of these show that you're committed. Outsiders might see pain and nonsense. Insiders see devotion and strength. The very irrationality of the act proves the depth of belief. Now, let's circle back to some modern examples. In part one, we talked about sacred cows in India and the South Korean sect following a dead pastor. On the surface, both practices can feel baffling. But when you view them through this lens, they make sense. In India, the cow isn't just an animal. It's a living symbol of nonviolence, abundance, and the sacredness of life itself. Protecting cows reinforces a cultural identity rooted in Hindu values. For believers, it's not irrational at all. It's an act of moral clarity. And for the South Korean group, continuing to follow a deceased leader isn't about denying death. It's about preserving continuity, loyalty, and shared purpose in a confusing world. This is where we start to see a deeper pattern. Beliefs don't survive because they're scientifically accurate. They survive because they work on a human level. They meet needs that cold logic alone can't satisfy. Think about it. Logic won't comfort you when a loved one dies. Logic won't tell you why you're suffering, but your neighbor seems blessed. Logic won't give you rituals to mark your transitions in life, birth, marriage, death. But belief systems do. They fill the gaps where reason falls short. And sometimes, beliefs that look irrational from one perspective are highly adaptive in another. Protecting cows in India might look inconvenient in a crowded city, but in rural history, it promoted ecological balance and agricultural sustainability. Cargo cults may never have brought back U.S. planes, but they gave communities a sense of agency in a bewildering world. Even extreme rituals like scarification or prolonged fasting often strengthen social unity and identity. So the real question isn't, why do people believe strange things? The better question is, what role do those beliefs play in human survival and flourishing? Because when you ask that, you see less absurdity and more strategy. Religion, myth, and ritual aren't random. They're tools humans have developed to cope, connect, and carry on. That doesn't mean every belief is harmless. Some can be twisted into manipulation, fear, or violence. We'll explore that in later parts. But here, the point is this. When you encounter a belief that seems bizarre, try to look past the surface. Ask yourself what needs it fulfills, what fears it calms, what bonds it builds. Because 9 times out of 10, what looks irrational is actually a very human attempt at making sense of life. And maybe that's the big lesson here. From cargo cults to ancient rituals, from sacred animals to modern sects, humans everywhere share the same deep drives: to find meaning, to feel safe, to belong, and to hope. Beliefs are the bridges we build toward those goals. Some bridges are fragile, some are strong, some are beautiful, and some are strange, but they all serve the same purpose: helping us cross the uncertainty of life with a little more courage. There's something almost magnetic about certain people, leaders whose words seem to pierce straight into the heart, whose presence feels larger than life, whose confidence makes others feel safe, guided, and purposeful. When we look at the history of religious and spiritual movements, one pattern emerges again and again. Behind nearly every powerful belief system is a figure who embodied those beliefs so completely that followers felt they were looking at truth itself in human form. Whether we're talking about prophets in the ancient world or controversial cult leaders in modern times, the psychology at work is strikingly similar. People crave direction, and they find it in the charisma of these leaders. Let's begin with a historical example. Think of figures like Moses in the Hebrew tradition. According to scripture, he was the one who confronted Pharaoh, parted the Red Sea, and delivered divine commandments directly to his people. Whether or not we view these events literally, what matters is how his followers perceived him: a direct channel to God, someone chosen to carry a message far beyond ordinary human capacity. Imagine being in that crowd, wandering through a desert, frightened, hungry, and uncertain about your future. And then you have this one man, standing tall, declaring that he knows the way forward because the divine itself has spoken to him. That kind of confidence, especially in times of chaos, can feel irresistible. Moses didn't just lead, he embodied certainty in a world full of fear. Fast forward to another historical example: the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century. A man born in Mecca, living among tribal societies torn apart by conflict, inequality, and idol worship, he claimed to receive revelations directly from God. To his followers, his words carried divine authority, and within his lifetime, he transformed the entire Arabian Peninsula. Again, whether one sees this religiously or historically, the human pattern is the same. A charismatic leader steps into a world full of disorder and offers a unifying vision. People yearn for stability and meaning, and when someone seems to offer both, especially with the aura of divine backing, it creates loyalty that can withstand incredible hardship. Now, if we shift to modern times, the psychology doesn't suddenly change. Take, for example, Jim Jones, leader of the People's Temple in the 1970s. At first, Jones presented himself as a progressive preacher, championing racial equality and social justice. He offered belonging to people who felt marginalized. But as his charisma grew, so did his control, eventually leading more than 900 people to follow him into a mass suicide in Jonestown, Guyana. To outsiders, this seems unimaginable. How could people go along with such extremity? But inside the movement, Jones was not just a preacher. He was the central figure of hope, family, and authority. People trusted him with their lives because he had become the anchor of their identity. The same can be said for Sun Myung Moon, founder of the Unification Church in South Korea. His followers believed he was the true parent chosen by God to finish the work of Jesus. Through elaborate marriage ceremonies, strict community structures, and an aura of divine mission, Moon commanded intense devotion. He may not have been universally loved outside his movement, but inside it, he was a source of ultimate meaning and order. Again, the charisma of one individual created an entire worldview that sustained itself for decades. So what is it about humans that makes us so susceptible to these figures? Psychologists talk about charismatic authority, a term made famous by sociologist Max Weber. Unlike traditional authority, like a king who rules because of heritage, or rational authority, like elected officials who rule by law, charismatic authority is deeply personal. It's about the belief that a leader has extraordinary qualities, sometimes superhuman ones, that justify obedience and devotion. And here's the catch: this authority only works if followers believe in it. In other words, charisma is co-created. The leader exudes confidence, but the followers project onto them their deepest desires: safety, guidance, transcendence. Consider how this plays out in both ancient and modern contexts. In ancient times, people might interpret charisma as divine election. This person must be chosen by God, because how else could they command such presence? In modern times, even in secular settings, charisma still feels almost supernatural. Think about how people describe modern celebrities or political figures. He lights up the room, or she makes you feel like the only person in the world when she speaks to you. These are echoes of the same dynamic that made prophets and cult leaders compelling. Charisma doesn't always have to be religious, but when it is framed in religious terms, it becomes nearly unshakable. There's also the social side of it. Following a charismatic leader isn't just about the leader themselves, it's about the community that forms around them. When you join a group devoted to a prophet, guru, or preacher, you're not just believing in one person. You're stepping into a network of people who reinforce your belief daily. Every prayer meeting, every ritual, every shared sacrifice tells you, yes, this leader is real, and we are part of something bigger than ourselves. It's a self-reinforcing loop, and it's why people will defend their leaders so passionately, even against overwhelming evidence to the contrary. And it's important to note that charisma itself isn't inherently negative. Many leaders who are remembered positively, think of Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., or the Dalai Lama, also possessed an incredible charisma. They too drew followers not only because of their ideas, but because of their personal presence. The difference lies in how that charisma is used to liberate or to control, to empower or to dominate. The same psychological mechanisms can lead to either justice movements or destructive cults. When we step back, part 3 of this exploration shows us that the power of leaders is less about logic and more about emotion. People rarely follow someone because the doctrines are perfectly rational. They follow because the leader makes them feel something: safety in uncertainty, unity in division, hope in despair, purpose in confusion. Across time and culture, that emotional pull has shaped entire civilizations, and in some cases, led people to their doom. So the question becomes, what makes charisma so sticky, so resistant to doubt? Why do people cling to leaders even when the evidence turns dark? In the next section, we'll go deeper into the psychology of belief perseverance, the mechanisms that keep faith alive, even against reason. But for now, it's enough to recognize this. Humans have always been drawn to the flame of charisma. Whether in the deserts of the Middle East thousands of years ago, or in a remote jungle commune in the 20th century, the pattern holds. The leader shines, the followers gather, and a belief system takes root. Sometimes uplifting, sometimes catastrophic, but always deeply human. Human beings are astonishingly good at finding reasons to keep believing, even when confronted with evidence that challenges everything they've held sacred. This isn't weakness, it's a survival mechanism. Psychologists call it cognitive dissonance, the uncomfortable tension that arises when reality conflicts with belief. Our brains crave consistency, and when confronted with a threat to a core belief, we twist, rationalize, and reinterpret facts to preserve that belief. In the context of religious or charismatic systems, this psychological armor can make followers nearly impervious to external critique. Take, for instance, the story of Job from the Hebrew Bible. Job is faithful, righteous, and upright, yet he suffers immensely, losing his family, wealth, and health. By any modern standard, his plight is unjust, cruel, even absurd. And yet within the narrative, Job is held up as the exemplar of piety and endurance. His unwavering faith, despite incomprehensible suffering, is portrayed as virtuous. For centuries, this story has been interpreted not as a cautionary tale of blind obedience, but as a moral guide for believers. Suffering is a test, and resistance is tantamount to heresy. The lesson? Even overwhelming evidence of cruelty or injustice can be reframed to reinforce faith rather than weaken it. Fast forward to modern examples. Consider cults like Heaven's Gate in the 1990s. Members faced isolation, strict rules, and ultimately agreed to a mass suicide. From the outside, this appears insane. But inside the community, cognitive dissonance operated in full force. Members had invested their identities, social lives, and entire belief systems into the movement. Leaving wasn't simply abandoning a leader, it was abandoning their family, their purpose, their very reality. The more they invested, the stronger their need to rationalize, to reinterpret inconsistencies, to preserve belief. Dissent wasn't merely frowned upon, it was existentially threatening. Historical leaders, too, leveraged this phenomenon. Take the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. Their decrees weren't questioned not merely because dissent was dangerous, but because the populace had been socialized to see their rulers as divine incarnations. The extraordinary display of rituals, monumental architecture, and elaborate ceremonies created an immersive world where leaving the belief system wasn't just rebellion, it was unthinkable. Cognitive dissonance ensured that any inconsistencies in leadership, injustice, or cruelty were absorbed into a broader narrative of divine plan. Pharaohs didn't merely command obedience, they shaped reality to make obedience the only rational response. Even in secular contexts, the pattern persists. Political leaders with intense charisma, think Napoleon, Mussolini, or more recently, certain authoritarian figures, build systems that reward loyalty and punish doubt. Citizens and followers rationalize failures, rewrite history, and double down on belief because leaving the system threatens not just social cohesion, but personal identity. The human mind is wired to preserve a coherent story, and when leaders intertwine themselves with meaning itself, leaving is profoundly destabilizing. Religious structures amplify this. Rituals, sacred texts, hymns, and communal reinforcement act like constant reminders that the system is correct. Every ritual reinforces the narrative: obedience equals blessing, doubt equals danger. Over time, cognitive dissonance becomes self reinforcing. Even when faced with historical evidence, moral contradictions, or internal doubt, believers reinterpret the data to maintain belief. For example, atrocities committed in the name of a god are reframed as divine mystery, tests of faith, or necessary evils. This is why people can reconcile participation in wars, support for discriminatory laws, or acceptance of suffering as a moral imperative. They are absorbing cognitive dissonance into their spiritual identity. Modern psychology also highlights the role of social proof. Humans are inherently social creatures, and we look to others to determine correct behavior. In highly insular religious or ideological communities, social pressure intensifies cognitive dissonance. If everyone around you believes and rationalizes in a particular way, your mind adapts to avoid social and emotional isolation. This is why individuals raised in rigid, fear-based religious systems often internalize teachings even when they encounter contradictory information later in life. It's not just about personal belief, it's about belonging. Historical examples abound. During the Spanish Inquisition, individuals accused of heresy faced torture and public execution. Yet many did not confess to abandoning the faith, despite facing excruciating physical pain. Why? Because their entire social identity, sense of morality, and understanding of the cosmos were intertwined with the Church's authority. Cognitive dissonance and social proof combine to make the cost of leaving incomprehensibly high, reinforcing obedience even under duress. Even outside extreme cases, cognitive dissonance is at play in daily religious life. People reinterpret failed prayers, unfulfilled promises, or moral contradictions as part of a divine plan. A promised miracle that never materializes is attributed to hidden wisdom or tests of faith. A leader's flawed behavior is excused as human imperfection or as a necessary component of a divine mission. In other words, believers are constantly integrating dissonant information in ways that maintain internal consistency. The mind prefers a coherent narrative over confronting uncomfortable truths. And here's a crucial point. Cognitive dissonance isn't inherently negative. It allows humans to function, to maintain stability, and to persevere through suffering. The problem arises when it becomes a mechanism for control. When religious or political leaders exploit this human tendency deliberately, it can justify cruelty, oppression, and even mass violence. Belief becomes not just faith, but a cage. This interplay between charisma and cognitive dissonance is central to understanding why historical and modern leaders can inspire devotion, obedience, and even complicity in moral wrongs. Moses, Muhammad, pharaohs, Napoleon, Jim Jones, all operated within systems that intertwined charisma, identity, and communal reinforcement. Their followers were not merely passive, they were active participants in creating a shared reality, one where obedience seemed morally necessary, even in the face of suffering. In examining this pattern, we also confront the unsettling truth. Belief is not only shaped by facts, doctrine, or moral reasoning. It is shaped by emotion, identity, and the human need for coherent narrative. A god, a prophet, or a leader doesn't just command actions. They shape the framework through which reality itself is interpreted. This explains why morality, justice, and evidence often bend around the needs of belief systems. Followers are not blind in a simplistic sense. They are navigating an intricate, self-reinforcing web of identity, social pressure, and cognitive necessity. By the end of this exploration, the lesson is clear. Understanding the psychological mechanisms that sustain belief is essential to understanding human history. Wars, crusades, inquisitions, and cults are not anomalies. They are manifestations of patterns deeply embedded in our species. Charisma draws us in, cognitive dissonance keeps us in, and social reinforcement binds us to the system. It is a recipe that has repeated itself from ancient deserts to modern cities, from sacred texts to secular ideologies. Throughout history, leaders, divine, royal, or political, have mastered a simple but devastating formula: fear plus reward equals obedience. This principle transcends culture, geography, and time. From the harsh edicts of pharaohs to the codified punishments in the Hebrew Bible, from medieval monarchs to modern authoritarian regimes, the combination of promised blessings and threatened suffering has been an extraordinarily effective mechanism for controlling populations. Consider again the story of the Exodus. The narrative repeatedly emphasizes that Pharaoh's heart is hardened, not by divine intervention, but as part of a system of control. Plagues rain down upon Egypt, the innocent perish, and yet the message is clear. Obedience to God, or in Pharaoh's case, submission to divine authority, is non negotiable. The principle is psychologically profound. Fear creates urgency, reward creates hope. The interplay ensures that even when people are terrified, they remain motivated to comply. Ancient Israelites learned that the path to survival, prosperity, and blessing was obedience, and that deviation could invite catastrophic consequences. In modern times, the principle is not confined to religious texts. Consider political regimes where loyalty is constantly monitored, where reward comes in the form of status, favor, or material gain, and where punishment ranges from public shaming to imprisonment, or worse. The totalitarian governments of the 20th century, for example, combined propaganda with fear. Citizens were inundated with messages that praised loyalty and demonized dissent. Fear of imprisonment, execution, or societal ostracism was ever present, ensuring that obedience was not optional. In essence, the leaders created a living, breathing version of the divine edicts in ancient scriptures. Obey, and you thrive. Resist, and you suffer. Even in less extreme societies, the fear-reward model shapes human behavior profoundly. Schools, workplaces, and social hierarchies rely on similar mechanisms. Praise, promotion, and recognition are incentives. Penalties, ostracism, and criticism are deterrents. Yet when this principle is applied on a mass scale with existential stakes, life, death, or eternal punishment, the results become catastrophic. The Bible repeatedly showcases this model. Consider the repeated threats of hell for unbelief, the promise of paradise for obedience. The cycles of reward and punishment function not just as moral instruction, but as behavioral engineering. History offers sobering examples of how deeply this model penetrates human psychology. During the Inquisition, fear of torture and execution compelled confessions, whether truthful or fabricated. Individuals betrayed friends, family, and their own conscience, all in the name of survival. Yet simultaneously, rewards existed: forgiveness, redemption, or protection. The combination created a system so psychologically binding that even the cruelest contradictions of doctrine, permitting cruelty while promoting divine love, were accepted and internalized. Fear and reward did not just control behavior, they reshaped morality itself. The story of Job once again illustrates this dynamic with a spiritual twist. Job suffers immensely, and yet the narrative frames his eventual restoration as proof of divine justice and the rewards of unwavering faith. His suffering, terrifying as it is, becomes a form of moral instruction. Endurance in fear guarantees eventual reward. This mirrors secular systems as well. Leaders throughout history have utilized suffering as a teaching tool. The punished become examples, the compliant are celebrated. The principle is universal: fear structures behavior, and reward solidifies loyalty. Moses, Abraham, and even Jesus, in their narratives, deploy fear and reward with precision. Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac, Job's endurance, and the teachings of eternal punishment are all variations of the same psychological formula. By intertwining fear and reward with morality, these stories ensure obedience without necessarily cultivating independent ethical reasoning. The lesson becomes less about justice or compassion and more about survival and compliance. History shows this principle in real-world governance, too. Roman emperors, medieval kings, and modern dictators have mastered it. Threats of exile, execution, or public disgrace were offset by the promise of favor, wealth, or social elevation. Obedience becomes rational because deviation is psychologically and materially costly. What makes this model so effective and terrifying is its adaptability. It does not require cruelty in every moment. Rather, it functions through the perception of omnipresent control. In the biblical texts, God does not have to destroy every city or strike down every sinner at every moment. The constant threat is sufficient to maintain obedience. Pharaoh's repeated plagues illustrate this. It is not the final plague alone that compels action, but the sustained psychological pressure leading up to it. Similarly, modern authoritarian states need not punish every transgression. The knowledge that punishment is possible creates self-policing, fear-driven compliance. Even when societies claim moral progress, the fear-reward dynamic remains present, albeit subtly. Social media shaming, Legal consequences, economic incentives, and cultural norms are modern tools that mirror ancient principles. People act not always from intrinsic morality, but from a mix of fear and anticipated reward. The lesson from history is stark. Fear and reward, when entwined with authority, whether divine, political, or cultural, can guide human behavior with extraordinary precision. And yet, there is a fundamental paradox. The same mechanism that ensures obedience can also stifle true moral development. Individuals may comply outwardly while internally questioning, resenting, or rationalizing. They may commit acts of cruelty justified by the authority they fear or obey laws and doctrines they no longer believe in. In other words, fear and reward create the appearance of morality, not its essence. They shape behavior, not conscience. The Bible, in many instances, enforces this distinction. Obedience is rewarded. Independent ethical reasoning is rare, even discouraged. The ancient texts provide commandments, punishments, and promises, but rarely cultivate introspection or moral empathy beyond compliance. Historical leaders have leveraged this same insight. Pharaohs, emperors, monarchs, and even revolutionary figures understood that human behavior is far more predictable under the dual forces of fear and reward. Systems built on this principle can endure for centuries, producing immense social stability or immense cruelty. From the threat of eternal damnation to the reward of temporal prosperity, human societies have repeatedly fallen into this pattern, demonstrating both its power and its danger. Finally, it is worth noting that while fear and reward can enforce obedience, they cannot guarantee wisdom or justice. Structures built solely on control risk perpetuating cruelty, inequality, and suffering. The biblical examples, from the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah to the plagues of Egypt, are historical allegories for this fundamental truth. When obedience is prized over understanding, morality is instrumentalized, and humans become instruments in a system that values control above all else. Leaders, divine or mortal, can command actions, but they cannot instill ethical reasoning through fear alone. Unquestioned obedience, whether to divine authority, monarchs, or modern regimes, has shaped human history in profound and often devastating ways. The narratives within the Bible illustrate this principle with stark clarity. Stories of obedience rewarded and disobedience punished are repeated endlessly, from the binding of Isaac to the destruction of entire cities. These narratives do more than tell moral tales. They establish behavioral blueprints, conditioning generations to accept authority without scrutiny. Take, for example, the story of the Israelites in the desert. Their survival, prosperity, and even entry into the Promised Land were contingent upon strict adherence to divine commands. Every act of defiance was met with immediate and sometimes catastrophic consequences. The generation that doubted or rebelled was barred from entering the land they had been promised. Children who questioned, elders who hesitated, and even leaders who faltered were subjected to punishment. The psychological lesson is unmistakable. Obedience is not merely recommended, it is existentially imperative. To disobey is to risk total annihilation. This pattern is not unique to religious texts. History is replete with examples of rulers and institutions leveraging obedience to consolidate power. Consider the Roman Empire, where citizens and subjects were expected to conform to laws, rituals, and cultural norms dictated from above. Dissent, whether political, social, or religious, was met with exile, execution, or public humiliation. Similarly, medieval monarchs enforced fealty through a combination of rewards, titles, and fear, ensuring that the population internalized obedience as a survival mechanism. The psychological effects of such systems are deep and lasting. When authority is unquestionable, compliance becomes reflexive, and moral reasoning is subordinated to survival. In modern times, the consequences of unquestioned obedience are just as evident, though often more subtle. Authoritarian regimes, for example, rely on indoctrination, propaganda, and fear to maintain compliance. Citizens are taught from birth that the rules are absolute, that questioning the system is dangerous, and that loyalty ensures safety and reward. Yet obedience in these contexts often comes at a moral cost. Individuals may participate in actions they privately recognize as unjust, complicit in systemic cruelty, simply because the cost of resistance is too high. The parallels with ancient texts are striking. Obedience replaces conscience, fear replaces judgment, and authority dictates morality. Even in societies that champion freedom, the effects of ingrained obedience persist. Social hierarchies, corporate structures, and legal systems all condition people to follow rules, often without questioning their ethical implications. The subtle reinforcement of authority through praise, penalties, or social pressure creates a framework where compliance becomes normalized. The Bible, with its stories of divine commands, serves as a template for this dynamic. Humans are trained to act without questioning, to trust that the authority knows best, and to fear the consequences of dissent. Historical events illustrate the tragic outcomes of such unquestioned obedience. During the Crusades, for example, armies marched, plundered, and killed in the name of divine command, believing they were executing a moral imperative. Inquisition tribunals punished heresy, often using torture, in the belief that loyalty to divine law justified extreme cruelty. Colonial empires exploited obedience to maintain control over subjugated populations, presenting conquest and subjugation as divinely sanctioned. In each case, obedience supplanted moral reasoning, and the results were catastrophic: mass suffering, cultural erasure, and generational trauma. The Bible itself highlights the tension between obedience and justice. The Ten Commandments, often cited as moral guidance, are predominantly about loyalty to God. Obedience is prioritized over ethical reasoning. The stories within the text frequently reward those who comply, regardless of the moral implications of their actions, and punish those who hesitate, question, or interpret the rules differently. This distinction between obedience and moral understanding has real-world consequences. It conditions individuals to act in accordance with authority rather than ethical principle, fostering environments where cruelty can flourish under the guise of righteousness. Modern psychology offers insights into why unquestioned obedience is so powerful. The concept of authority-induced compliance demonstrates that individuals often perform actions they would otherwise consider immoral when directed by perceived authority figures. Stanley Milgram's experiments in the 1960s revealed that ordinary people could administer extreme punishment simply because an authority figure instructed them to do so. The parallel with religious narratives is clear. Divine commands, framed as absolute and unquestionable, function similarly to authoritative instructions in experimental settings. Fear of punishment and promise of reward create conditions where moral agency is suppressed. The societal consequences are equally profound. When obedience is valued above reasoning, communities can justify atrocities in the name of law, tradition, or divine command. Individuals learn to defer ethical judgment, assuming that authority figures or sacred texts will determine right and wrong. The result is a culture where systemic injustices, slavery, conquest, discrimination, and persecution can persist for generations under the moral justification of obedience. The Bible's accounts, particularly of wars, divine punishments, and tests of faith, illustrate this dynamic vividly. Fear and obedience are instruments of control, shaping societies at their core. Moreover, unquestioned obedience affects personal morality and identity. Children raised in systems that emphasize fear and reward as primary motivators often internalize these principles. They learn to equate goodness with compliance and sin with doubt or defiance. Over time, this conditioning can suppress critical thinking, moral intuition, and empathy, producing individuals who follow rules without ethical reflection. The consequences are intergenerational. Obedience becomes cultural DNA, embedded in social structures, family dynamics, and institutional norms. It is worth noting, however, that not all obedience is harmful. Societies require some degree of conformity to function, from traffic laws to social norms. Yet the Bible, historical empires, and modern authoritarian states illustrate the dangers of absolute obedience. When compliance is demanded without question, when fear and reward are wielded as instruments of control, morality is instrumentally subordinated to survival. The distinction is critical. Obedience for social cohesion or protection is one thing. Obedience enforced through existential fear and divine or political authority is another entirely. The consequences extend beyond individual morality. Whole societies can be structured around obedience, producing cultures of conformity, suspicion, and sanctioned cruelty. The Bible's narratives repeatedly showcase these patterns: mass punishments, divine favor for the compliant, and severe consequences for dissent. When applied historically, these principles enabled wars, inquisitions, and systemic oppression. When applied psychologically, they shaped generations to internalize obedience as the highest virtue. Ultimately, the story is one of power. Whether divine or human, authority paired with fear and reward has the capacity to mold societies and individuals alike. The Bible, like many historical texts, provides a blueprint. Obedience, reinforced by existential consequences, shapes morality, behavior, and identity. History, psychology, and sociology all confirm the enduring potency of this dynamic. The lessons are both cautionary and illuminating. Unquestioned obedience may maintain order, but it often does so at the cost of justice, empathy, and ethical reasoning. Fear has long been one of humanity's most effective instruments of control. Across cultures and centuries, rulers, priests, and institutions have recognized its power. The Bible, in many ways, exemplifies the strategic use of fear to dictate behavior. From the threat of eternal punishment in the afterlife to immediate retribution for disobedience, fear functions as both deterrent and motivator. The narratives are structured to instill awe, reverence, and trembling obedience, conditioning adherents to follow divine law without question. Consider the story of the plagues in Egypt. Pharaoh's hardened heart is met with escalating catastrophes, rivers turning to blood, infestations of insects, and disease sweeping through livestock. The final plague claims the lives of Egyptian children. The narrative emphasizes the deadly consequences of disobedience and the ultimate authority of God. For those reading or hearing this story, the psychological impact is profound. Obedience is not merely recommended, it is a matter of survival. Such vivid depictions of divine wrath are designed to instill fear, ensuring compliance and loyalty. Fear, however, is not confined to the ancient texts. Historical rulers inspired or justified by religious authority have mirrored these dynamics in governance. During the medieval period, kings and church leaders often invoked divine retribution to maintain social order. Heretics were tortured, dissenters were executed, and entire populations were coerced into conformity through a combination of spiritual and temporal terror. The consequences of defiance were severe, mirroring the biblical paradigm. Fear ensured obedience, even when moral reasoning suggested resistance. The psychology behind this is well documented. Humans are wired to respond to threats. When the consequences of disobedience are portrayed as existential, eternal damnation, divine wrath, or social ostracism, fear becomes a potent regulator of behavior. This dynamic is amplified when authority is perceived as infallible, as in the case of God or a divine monarch. Individuals internalize the threat, regulating their own behavior and policing the behavior of others to avoid collective punishment. The mechanism is subtle but extraordinarily effective, allowing fear to function as a self-reinforcing tool of control. Modern parallels abound. Authoritarian regimes continue to wield fear to maintain power, using both overt and covert threats. Citizens may be punished for dissent, imprisoned for questioning authority, or socially shamed for perceived transgressions. The moral framework is subordinated to survival and compliance. Like the biblical narratives, these systems rely on the internalization of fear, training individuals to act against their own ethical judgments in favor of self-preservation and loyalty. Religious fear operates on a similar principle, but is magnified by the promise of eternal consequences. The doctrine of hell, vividly described as a place of never-ending torment, exemplifies this. Fear of eternal suffering compels obedience not just in mundane matters, but in the most profound existential choices: belief, worship, and moral conduct. The narrative creates a high-stakes environment where deviation is not merely socially frowned upon, but cosmically catastrophic. Such fear is psychologically binding, shaping thought, emotion, and decision-making from a very young age. The historical consequences are striking. Throughout the Middle Ages and into the early modern period, fear-based morality justified violence, discrimination, and systemic oppression. The Inquisition, witch hunts, and crusades were fueled by the belief that failure to enforce divine law equated to cosmic failure. Individuals were coerced into participation, not merely by direct threat, but by fear of communal or divine retribution. Compliance became synonymous with righteousness, while moral reasoning was subordinated to survival instincts reinforced by fear. Even outside explicit religious contexts, fear continues to dictate human behavior. Social, political, and institutional structures often operate on a similar principle. Laws, norms, and enforcement mechanisms create predictable consequences for noncompliance, encouraging obedience through anxiety, threat, or punishment. While not always morally corrupt, the mechanism mirrors biblical models. Fear shapes behavior, limits autonomy, and can override ethical judgment when authority is unquestioned. The consequences extend to personal morality. Individuals conditioned to respond to fear may internalize rigid definitions of right and wrong, suppressing critical thought. Questioning, doubt, and independent ethical reasoning are perceived as dangerous. The Bible repeatedly emphasizes this: obedience is rewarded, and questioning is punished. The story of Lot's wife, turned to salt for looking back, exemplifies the extreme consequences of defiance, reinforcing the lesson that fear of punishment outweighs curiosity or moral reflection. Fear also perpetuates cycles of violence. Societies that internalize fear-based obedience are more likely to justify cruelty, punish transgression harshly, and normalize coercion. Historical events, from medieval executions to colonial conquests, reflect this principle. The Bible, by presenting fear as a legitimate motivator sanctioned by divine authority, sets a precedent. The end justifies the obedience, and obedience justifies the means, even when morally troubling. Importantly, the stories also show the consequences of excessive fear. Characters are often paralyzed, unable to act morally or wisely, because they are overwhelmed by the threat of punishment. The Israelites, Pharaoh, or Lot's contemporaries illustrate how fear can distort judgment, encourage cruelty, and suppress empathy. By instilling terror, these narratives show how authority can control not just actions but thoughts, shaping societies to align with the desires of those in power. Modern psychology and sociology support these observations. Research on obedience, authority, and compliance shows that fear-based systems produce predictable behaviors, increased conformity, decreased empathy, and moral disengagement. When fear of punishment supersedes ethical reasoning, individuals become instruments of the system, perpetuating cycles of harm without reflection or accountability. The parallels with biblical narratives are unmistakable, demonstrating that fear is not merely a narrative tool, but a fundamental mechanism of societal control. In conclusion, fear has always been one of the most effective tools for controlling human behavior. The Bible exemplifies its use, presenting divine punishment as a compelling motivator for obedience. History reflects the real-world consequences of this principle, from medieval monarchies to modern authoritarian states. Individuals internalize fear, suppress independent moral reasoning, and perpetuate systems of coercion, often at great cost to justice, empathy, and freedom. The lessons are timeless. Fear can command obedience, but it comes at the expense of ethical growth, societal fairness, and personal autonomy. The Bible often presents a stark tension between obedience and justice, where following divine commands takes precedence over ethical reasoning. From the very beginning, stories emphasize that adherence to God's will is the highest moral duty, often outweighing compassion, fairness, or human reasoning. This framework creates a society where the measure of virtue is not the quality of one's actions toward others, but the degree of submission to divine authority. Consider the story of Abraham, commanded to sacrifice his son Isaac. Abraham's moral compass might recoil at the idea of harming his child, yet obedience is demanded above all else. The narrative praises his willingness to comply, portraying it as a pinnacle of faith. Moral reasoning, empathy, and parental responsibility are subordinated to obedience. The tension is clear. Faith is measured by the capacity to act against one's ethical instincts when ordered to do so by God. For the audience, this story reinforces the notion that ethical dilemmas are to be resolved not by human judgment, but by unwavering loyalty to divine authority. This principle echoes throughout biblical law. The Ten Commandments, often cited as the foundation of morality, are revealing in this regard. The first 4 commandments concern loyalty to God. Worship no other gods, avoid idolatry, keep God's name sacred, and observe the Sabbath. Only 6 commandments address interpersonal conduct, and even those are framed within a limited scope, leaving issues such as slavery, the treatment of strangers, and gender equality largely unregulated. Justice, in the modern sense, is secondary to obedience. Following God's will is the central moral imperative, even when it conflicts with empathy or fairness. Historical societies that interpreted these laws literally often mirrored this hierarchy of obedience over justice. Kings, judges, and religious authorities used the biblical model to justify actions that, by contemporary standards, would be considered cruel or unjust. Disobedience to divine or human authority could result in death, exile, or social exclusion. Individuals were taught to prioritize loyalty and ritual compliance, often at the expense of ethical reflection. Entire communities were shaped to accept that moral rightness is determined by adherence to external rules rather than the consideration of harm, fairness, or human dignity. The consequences are vividly illustrated in episodes such as the stoning of the Sabbath violator. A man picking up sticks on a day commanded for rest faces execution, not as a correction for harm done to others, but for violating ritual law. The act of obedience supersedes justice. The severity of punishment reflects the value placed on compliance rather than the ethical dimension of the offense. Such narratives communicate that morality is synonymous with submission, creating a psychological environment where questioning or ethical reasoning is not just discouraged, it is dangerous. The pattern extends beyond ancient times. Historical leaders, drawing on biblical authority, often enacted laws and policies prioritizing obedience over justice. During the colonial era, religious justification was used to enforce subjugation, exploit populations, and suppress dissent. The alignment of divine mandate with legal authority created a system where human suffering could be rationalized as part of a moral hierarchy ordained by God. Justice became contingent upon obedience, not fairness, empathy, or reasoned deliberation. This tension also affects personal moral development. Individuals raised in environments where obedience is prized above ethical reasoning may struggle to reconcile instinctive notions of right and wrong with mandated behavior. Questioning authority can be equated with rebellion, and moral intuition may be suppressed to avoid punishment. The stories in the Bible, repeatedly emphasizing that failure to comply incurs severe consequences, function as training manuals in obedience. Ethical reflection is subordinated to fear-based compliance, and justice becomes a secondary concern. Moreover, the hierarchical structure of obedience can perpetuate systemic harm. Communities organized around strict compliance often rationalize violence or oppression as morally necessary. Orders from authority are executed without question, even when the outcomes are ethically problematic. Historical events, from the execution of heretics to violent religious conquests, exemplify this principle. Individuals acting in good faith, believing themselves to be upholding divine will, may commit atrocities in the name of obedience, illustrating the dangers of prioritizing submission over justice. Yet, the biblical texts themselves offer subtle reflections on this tension. Figures like Moses, Job, and Jonah reveal the personal and societal costs of rigid obedience. Moses, punished for minor disobedience despite a lifetime of service, highlights the precarious balance between loyalty and justice. Job, tested through extreme suffering, embodies the psychological toll of submission to divine will. Jonah's reluctance to obey and his subsequent lessons demonstrate the human struggle to navigate moral choice when commanded by authority. These narratives underscore the inherent tension. Obedience may be lauded, but it carries ethical and emotional consequences. Modern parallels are clear. Societies that enforce rigid obedience, whether through religious, political, or cultural authority, often experience similar moral distortions. Individuals may suppress personal judgment to conform, and systemic injustice is justified in the name of maintaining order or fulfilling mandates. Historical and contemporary leaders alike have exploited the principle that obedience is paramount, whether in theocratic governments, military hierarchies, or authoritarian states. The lesson is stark. When obedience becomes the measure of virtue, justice is compromised and moral agency is diminished. Importantly, the Bible's emphasis on obedience over justice has also shaped legal and social institutions beyond religion. Legal systems in Europe and colonial territories often incorporated biblical principles, prioritizing hierarchical authority, and codified law over ethical discretion. Judges and rulers invoked divine sanction to enforce compliance, frequently punishing acts of mercy or ethical reasoning that contradicted strict interpretation. The historical consequences were profound. Injustice was systematized, and ethical reasoning was delegitimized. reinforcing the primacy of obedience as the ultimate moral value. The interplay between obedience and justice is not merely historical, it continues to influence modern thinking. Individuals and institutions sometimes default to following authority without questioning ethical implications, relying on external validation of right and wrong rather than internal moral reflection. The biblical model, emphasizing loyalty to divine law above all else, contributes to this enduring tendency. Understanding this dynamic is crucial for evaluating the moral frameworks inherited from religious traditions and their impact on contemporary society. In essence, Part 8 reveals that biblical law often places obedience above justice, shaping moral and social structures around compliance rather than fairness. Historical examples demonstrate the consequences: systemic oppression, violence, and the suppression of moral reasoning. The stories themselves underscore the tension, highlighting the human cost of prioritizing loyalty to authority over ethical judgment. The lesson extends beyond Scripture. Societies that value obedience above justice risk perpetuating harm, suppressing empathy, and undermining moral autonomy. One of the most striking and contentious aspects of the biblical narrative is the repeated portrayal of divine favoritism. God is depicted as granting special status, blessings, and protection to certain individuals, families, and tribes, often at the expense of others. This favoritism is not framed as a reward for universal virtue or moral excellence. It is often arbitrary, tribal, and exclusive, creating a moral hierarchy that elevates some while condemning or neglecting others. The implications of such favoritism are profound, both historically and ethically, and they resonate far beyond the ancient world. Take, for example, the case of the Israelites. Throughout the Old Testament, they are depicted as God's chosen people, the recipients of divine laws, promises, and protection. Other nations, by contrast, are frequently portrayed as objects of wrath, conquest, or annihilation. This distinction fosters an exclusive worldview. Morality, justice, and divine favor are not universal principles, but privileges bestowed upon a particular group. Ethical consideration for outsiders is secondary, and acts of violence against other peoples are justified as fulfilling God's will. The narrative suggests that loyalty to God, rather than ethical behavior toward humanity, is the primary metric of moral worth. Historical leaders often mirrored this principle of favoritism in governance. Kings and rulers invoked divine sanction to legitimize territorial expansion, conquest, and subjugation of rival groups. The idea that God had a chosen people provided moral cover for actions that, by modern ethical standards, would be considered deeply unjust. For example, military campaigns in biblical times were often framed as the execution of divine judgment, granting leaders a moral authority to commit acts that would otherwise be morally indefensible. This use of religious favoritism as political justification created a culture in which obedience and ethnic or tribal loyalty were paramount, often overshadowing considerations of justice, mercy, or fairness. The consequences of divine favoritism are also evident in interpersonal stories within the Bible. Figures like Joseph, favored by his father Jacob, receive blessings and status that provoke jealousy and conflict among siblings. While these narratives may explore human emotion and familial dynamics, they also reinforce the notion that divine attention is selective, creating hierarchies of worth and privilege. Those outside the favored circle may be punished, ignored, or marginalized, illustrating the tension between arbitrary divine preference and human expectations of fairness. This theme of selective favor extends to modern moral reflection as well. When a system of ethics prioritizes the well-being of a chosen few, it often justifies harm against others. Historical parallels are abundant. European monarchs, colonial powers, and political leaders have used religious narratives of chosen status to legitimize slavery, genocide, and the displacement of entire populations. In each case, the moral logic mirrors the biblical model. Divine favoritism becomes a rationale for injustice, and ethical obligations to outsiders are diminished or disregarded. Leaders claim that their authority and actions are sanctioned by God, and the lives of those outside the favored group are devalued accordingly. Even within personal morality, divine favoritism shapes human behavior. Individuals who believe themselves to be chosen or specially blessed may develop a sense of entitlement or moral superiority. Conversely, Those outside this privileged status may internalize feelings of exclusion or inferiority, accepting injustice as divinely ordained. The psychological impact is profound. Belief in divine favoritism teaches that moral worth is externally assigned rather than universally shared, undermining principles of fairness, empathy, and equality. The Bible also portrays favoritism as a tool for social control. By promising reward to some and punishment to others, the narrative enforces compliance with divine law. Obedience is rewarded with protection, prosperity, or status, while disobedience or outsider status leads to suffering, exile, or death. Historical leaders who drew on this framework reinforced social hierarchies, using divine sanction to maintain control over populations. Fear of divine wrath and hope for divine favor became powerful motivators, compelling individuals to conform, participate in acts of violence, or accept social inequities as morally justified. Modern reflections on divine favoritism reveal its enduring influence. Systems that prioritize the rights or well-being of select groups over others, whether based on religion, ethnicity, or ideology, often produce structural injustices. Leaders and institutions justify preferential treatment for insiders while rationalizing harm or neglect for outsiders. The biblical model, with its emphasis on chosen peoples and divine favoritism, offers a historical precedent for such ethical distortions. It demonstrates how religious narratives can reinforce systemic inequality, shaping moral norms and societal structures across centuries. Critically, the notion of favoritism challenges the idea of universal morality. If God's approval is selective, then moral rightness becomes contingent on belonging to a particular group rather than on ethical principles applicable to all humans. Justice becomes conditional, and the value of human life is measured not by intrinsic worth, but by proximity to divine favor. For a contemporary audience, this raises difficult questions. Can moral authority be derived from selective favoritism? Is it ethical to judge actions differently based on the identity of the actor? The Bible presents a world where such judgments are normative, inviting readers to confront uncomfortable truths about power, privilege, and morality. Furthermore, divine favoritism complicates interpretations of ethical leadership. Historical and modern leaders alike have used the concept of being chosen or sanctioned by a higher power to consolidate authority and justify actions. Kings, generals, and political figures claim divine endorsement to validate conquests, enforce laws, or suppress dissent. The moral logic mirrors the biblical pattern. The favored group is righteous, their enemies are condemned, and obedience to authority is framed as a sacred duty. This has profound consequences for societies, often enabling atrocities and systemic oppression under the guise of divine morality. Finally, divine favoritism in the Bible raises questions about the nature of ethical obligation. Are humans bound to obey divine commands regardless of harm? Does morality require adherence to selective favoritism? Or can ethical principles transcend favoritism and tribal loyalty? The narratives challenge readers to distinguish between divine authority and universal ethical reasoning. They demonstrate how selective favor can distort moral judgment, creating a hierarchy in which justice is contingent on belonging rather than universally applied principles. In Part 9, the emphasis on divine favoritism illustrates the historical and psychological mechanisms by which biblical narratives shaped societies, moral reasoning, and leadership. From the privileged status of the Israelites to the selective blessings of key figures, the stories reinforce obedience and loyalty over universal justice. Historical leaders and modern parallels show the dangers of using favoritism as a moral compass, highlighting the enduring relevance of these ancient narratives in understanding systemic inequality and the ethical consequences of privileging some over others. Throughout the Bible, one of the most persistent themes is the use of punishment and suffering as a tool to enforce obedience, instill fear, and maintain social and moral order. From the earliest chapters of Genesis to the prophetic declarations in the later books, the narrative repeatedly portrays a God who rewards compliance and punishes disobedience with extraordinary severity. The stories are vivid, often terrifying, and always morally instructive, at least according to the perspective of the text. Yet when examined closely, they reveal a pattern in which fear, rather than understanding or empathy, is the primary instrument of control. Consider the story of Adam and Eve. Their original sin, is not merely an act of disobedience, but a violation of a divine command whose consequences are catastrophic. The punishment, expulsion from Eden, pain in childbirth, and toil for survival, is not proportional in any modern sense. This narrative sets a precedent. Human beings are flawed by design, and suffering is an inevitable and just consequence of deviation from divine law. The fear of such punishment is meant to ensure obedience, creating a psychological framework in which morality is inseparable from terror. The lesson is reinforced throughout Scripture. Disobedience brings not just correction, but ruin. This pattern escalates in the story of Noah. The flood is perhaps the most extreme example of fear-driven compliance. The entire world, except for Noah and his family, is destroyed. Human beings and animals alike perish, not for crimes individually committed, but collectively as a form of divine retribution. The message is clear. Defiance of divine authority carries consequences so immense that they dwarf human comprehension. Fear is absolute, omnipresent, and absolute. Noah's obedience, contrasted with the destruction of the world, frames morality as survival, a lesson not in ethics or empathy, but in adherence to commands under the threat of annihilation. Similarly, the story of Job provides a more complex examination of suffering as a moral test. Job is a man of unwavering faith, yet he is subjected to relentless trials, loss of family, wealth, health, and security. The narrative frames these horrors as a test of loyalty rather than a consequence of wrongdoing. Suffering, in this case, becomes a mechanism to measure obedience and submission. It is not corrective or instructive in a human sense. It is performative, a demonstration of divine power. Job's endurance is praised, yet the moral lesson is unsettling. Virtue is valuable not in itself, but as proof of loyalty to an authority whose actions may be arbitrary and cruel. Historical leaders have long mirrored this dynamic. Kings, emperors, and religious authorities used fear of punishment, both earthly and divine, to enforce laws and maintain power. In medieval Europe, for instance, heresy trials, excommunications, and inquisitions were often justified using biblical narratives. The notion that God punishes disobedience provided moral and political cover for actions that, by any modern ethical standard, were abhorrent. Leaders invoke divine wrath to ensure loyalty and obedience, knowing that fear is a far more immediate motivator than conscience or empathy. In this sense, biblical narratives served as both template and validation for centuries of authority exercised through fear. Fear-driven morality is reinforced through vivid, often gruesome imagery. Cities are destroyed, plagues are unleashed, and individuals suffer public and personal calamities. These narratives communicate that disobedience has not just private consequences, but societal ones, making fear a communal experience. Leaders and priests could reference these stories to legitimize harsh punishments, public executions, and social ostracism. The mechanism is clear. Obedience is necessary not just to avoid personal suffering, but to prevent societal collapse, a moral architecture built on terror rather than understanding. Even in modern contexts, the legacy of fear as a tool of control is evident. Authoritarian regimes often exploit religious or ideological narratives to instill fear, presenting obedience as the path to survival and deviation as catastrophic. The Bible's emphasis on punishment, judgment, and divine wrath echoes through these historical patterns. The psychological effects of fear-driven obedience are profound. Individuals may internalize authority unquestioningly, suppress moral reasoning, or justify cruelty toward others if framed as sanctioned by a higher power. The interplay between suffering and morality is also central to understanding how these narratives shape ethical perception. If morality is framed as the avoidance of divine punishment rather than the pursuit of justice or empathy, ethical reasoning becomes conditional. Actions are judged not on their intrinsic goodness, but on their compliance with authority. This creates a moral system that rewards conformity over conscience, loyalty over compassion. Historical and modern leaders exploit this dynamic, creating societies in which fear of punishment enforces social cohesion at the expense of moral development. Biblical stories of suffering also demonstrate a striking asymmetry. Punishment is often indiscriminate, affecting the innocent along with the guilty. Children, animals, and non-combatants frequently bear the brunt of divine wrath. This raises ethical questions. Can obedience to authority be morally virtuous if it is sustained by fear and injustice? Does the threat of suffering produce moral people or merely compliant ones? The Bible's narratives suggest that fear, rather than ethical understanding, is the primary driver of human behavior, a lesson mirrored in many historical systems of governance. Moreover, fear as control is not limited to the punitive. Reward, too, is framed in extreme terms. Divine favor, blessings, and protection are offered to the obedient. These incentives reinforce the moral system, creating a binary in which individuals exist either under divine protection or under threat of annihilation. Such a framework diminishes the role of ethical deliberation, encouraging individuals to prioritize survival and favor over independent judgment. Historical leaders, understanding the power of both fear and reward, often replicated this system to strengthen authority, consolidating power by controlling both hope and terror. The psychological dimension is critical. The Bible depicts a world in which humans are trapped between the promise of reward and the threat of punishment, their moral choices governed less by conscience than by fear. Children raised within these narratives internalize the principle that deviation from prescribed rules is dangerous, fostering obedience, but also anxiety, guilt, and a conditional sense of morality. Adults operating under the same framework may become ruthless enforcers or passive victims, accepting suffering as inevitable and unquestionable. In sum, Part 10 demonstrates that punishment, suffering, and fear are central mechanisms through which biblical narratives shape human behavior and moral perception. The stories communicate that morality is inseparable from obedience, and fear is the primary instrument of compliance. Historical leaders adopted this model, legitimizing authority and justifying atrocities under the guise of divine sanction. Modern parallels continue to reveal the ethical dangers of systems built on fear rather than empathy, reason, or universal principles. The biblical emphasis on fear-based obedience underscores the tension between authority and moral autonomy, revealing a moral framework in which the ends, loyalty and submission, justify any means, however brutal or arbitrary. One of the most striking and enduring concepts in the Bible is the doctrine of original sin. It is introduced in Genesis with the story of Adam and Eve, whose disobedience results in consequences not only for themselves but for all their descendants. This idea, that humanity is born into guilt for actions committed by a distant ancestor, reframes morality entirely. It suggests that the foundation of human ethical experience is not personal responsibility, but inherited blame. From a modern perspective, this is a radical departure from any system of justice we recognize today, where fairness requires that punishment correspond to individual actions. Original sin does more than merely explain human imperfection. It establishes a moral hierarchy rooted in fear and dependency. By depicting humans as inherently flawed from birth, the narrative justifies the need for divine intervention, guidance, and ultimately salvation. In this framework, morality is less about understanding right from wrong and more about seeking forgiveness for a flaw that is intrinsic, unavoidable, and beyond personal control. The psychological impact is profound. A child taught that they are inherently guilty internalizes a sense of inadequacy, anxiety, and submission before an authority that promises both judgment and redemption. This concept is reinforced and expanded in later texts, where the need for obedience and belief becomes paramount. Individuals are not judged by the goodness of their actions alone, but by their acknowledgement of a specific divine authority and adherence to prescribed rituals and beliefs. A person could act with kindness, fairness, and compassion, yet remain condemned if they fail to meet the theological criteria of faith. The moral bar, therefore, is not defined by universal principles of empathy or justice, but by conformity to authority, a model that leaves little room for independent moral reasoning. Historical leaders have leveraged the idea of inherited or collective guilt to consolidate control. Monarchs and religious authorities often taught that sin is pervasive, extending through families, communities, and nations, thereby justifying extraordinary punishments or demands for loyalty. In medieval Europe, for example, accusations of heresy or witchcraft frequently targeted individuals whose guilt was inferred from lineage, community association, or alleged ancestral failings. The logic was chillingly consistent with the biblical narrative. Guilt is inherited, obedience is demanded, and transgression threatens both personal and communal survival. Fear of collective punishment reinforced social hierarchies and suppressed dissent, a mechanism that would echo for centuries. The moral implications extend beyond social control. By framing humanity as inherently flawed, the doctrine of original sin creates a system in which ethical agency is constrained. Humans are not seen as fully capable of independent moral reasoning. Their virtue is conditional, dependent on divine oversight. This diminishes the role of conscience, empathy, and personal responsibility, placing moral authority firmly in the hands of a higher power. From a modern ethical perspective, this framework risks producing compliance rather than genuine moral development, obedience rather than reflective virtue. Original sin also intersects with the narrative of redemption, most prominently through the figure of Jesus in the New Testament. The doctrine posits that humanity's inherent guilt requires atonement, typically through sacrificial acts. In Christian theology, the suffering and death of Jesus are presented as a necessary payment for humanity's inherited flaws, a solution framed as both divine justice and mercy. Yet, from a rational standpoint, this raises profound ethical questions. Can the punishment of one individual retroactively absolve the inherited guilt of all others? And is morality truly preserved when the standard for salvation is belief rather than ethical conduct? The narrative emphasizes submission to divine authority, creating a moral framework in which faith supersedes reason and inherited guilt supersedes personal accountability. The psychological consequences are equally significant. A person socialized within this doctrine may grow up feeling perpetually flawed, morally inadequate, and dependent on external authority for validation. The internalization of inherited guilt fosters anxiety and self-doubt, while also incentivizing obedience to prescribed rules as a means of avoiding punishment or securing redemption. Children raised with this framework learn that questioning authority is not merely intellectual curiosity, but moral risk, a dangerous act with consequences both temporal and eternal. Historical parallels are stark. Monarchies and empires have often relied on narratives of collective guilt or divine punishment to justify conquest, taxation, and social stratification. In many cases, leaders equated obedience with moral virtue and dissent with sin, leveraging fear to ensure loyalty and maintain order. The alignment between biblical narratives and historical practices of power is not coincidental. Both exploit the psychological mechanism of inherited guilt to reinforce authority and control behavior, demonstrating the enduring social potency of these moral concepts. Modern ethical reflection, however, challenges this framework. From the standpoint of human rights and personal responsibility, punishing individuals for the deeds of ancestors is profoundly unjust. It violates fundamental principles of fairness and equality, undermining the notion that morality is about conscious, accountable action. Contemporary society recognizes that ethical development arises from experience, empathy, and reflective judgment, not inherited blame. Yet the echoes of this doctrine persist in cultural and religious attitudes toward guilt, shame, and moral conformity. Moreover, original sin shapes the perception of human nature itself. By portraying people as flawed from birth, it implies that virtue is exceptional and that failure is inevitable. This worldview may cultivate humility, but it also risks promoting resignation, passivity, and dependence on authority figures for moral guidance. Individuals may defer to external rules rather than cultivating independent judgment, leading to societies in which obedience is valued more highly than critical thinking and compliance more than conscience. The historical consequences are profound. Legal systems, social hierarchies, and religious institutions have often mirrored this logic, punishing perceived inherited flaws and demanding rituals of absolution. In some cases, these practices have sanctioned violence, exclusion, and oppression, all justified through a moral lens derived from inherited guilt. From witch trials in Europe to social ostracism in religious communities, the ethical rationale consistently echoes the biblical premise: humanity is flawed by design, and obedience, submission, and atonement are the remedies. In modern ethical discourse, the doctrine of original sin invites critical scrutiny. While it offers a framework for understanding human imperfection and the necessity of moral development, its application as a system of inherited guilt is deeply problematic. True moral growth requires recognition of personal responsibility, the capacity for ethical reasoning and accountability for one's own actions, not punishment for the deeds of ancestors or submission to authority. By imposing guilt before action, the doctrine risks stifling moral autonomy and perpetuating cycles of fear and control. In conclusion, Part 11 illustrates how the concept of original sin and inherited guilt shapes morality, social behavior, and authority structures. It enforces obedience through fear and internalized guilt, constraining ethical reasoning and promoting compliance over conscience. Historical leaders have exploited this doctrine to maintain power and justify extraordinary measures, and the psychological effects continue to influence religious and cultural norms. While it may have served as a framework for understanding human imperfection, the doctrine also exemplifies the dangers of a moral system built on inherited guilt rather than personal responsibility, empathy, and reason. Understanding this dynamic is essential for evaluating the broader ethical implications of biblical narratives and their influence on human behavior across history. In the New Testament, the figure of Jesus emerges as both a continuation and a radical reinterpretation of earlier biblical themes. Often portrayed as a teacher of love, mercy, and compassion, Jesus nonetheless operates within a framework heavily influenced by the doctrine of original sin and the centrality of obedience. Salvation, in this context, is not merely the outcome of ethical behavior or moral reasoning. It is contingent on recognition of divine authority, faith in a particular narrative, and adherence to prescribed rituals. This creates a tension that has resonated through centuries of religious thought. Can morality truly be measured by obedience and belief rather than the quality of one's actions? The Gospels present Jesus as both compassionate and exacting, a figure whose teachings promise peace but also demand radical loyalty. Consider the famous passages where Jesus declares that anyone who does not hate their family cannot follow him, or where he speaks of eternal fire and punishment for the unfaithful. These statements are jarring when contrasted with his image as a figure of mercy, revealing the persistent emphasis on obedience and submission. Moral worth, according to these texts, is not primarily defined by acts of kindness or justice, but by alignment with divine will, a standard that privileges belief over ethical judgment. Historical leaders have often exploited this model of morality to consolidate control. In societies shaped by Christian doctrine, rulers and religious authorities alike emphasized faith as the ultimate marker of virtue. Heresy was punished, dissent suppressed, and conformity enforced, not necessarily to uphold ethical principles, but to maintain allegiance to an institution claiming divine endorsement. The alignment between divine obedience and social order created powerful incentives for compliance, reinforcing hierarchies and suppressing challenges to authority. From the Inquisitions of medieval Europe to the religious wars of early modern periods, the consequences of this emphasis on obedience were frequently catastrophic. From a modern ethical perspective, the insistence on faith over action introduces profound dilemmas. A person might perform acts of extraordinary compassion, bravery, and service, yet still be considered morally deficient if they fail to affirm particular beliefs. This raises questions about the universality of ethics. Can morality exist independently of religious adherence? Historical experience suggests that when belief becomes the primary measure of virtue, ethical reasoning is subordinated, and individuals are incentivized to prioritize ritual and loyalty over empathy and justice. Moreover, the narrative of salvation in Christian theology is deeply entwined with the suffering of another. The crucifixion of Jesus is presented as the ultimate sacrifice, a debt paid on behalf of all humanity to atone for inherited guilt. While this act is framed as divine mercy, it also exemplifies a system in which forgiveness and ethical reconciliation are mediated externally rather than arising from human understanding. From a critical standpoint, this raises difficult questions about autonomy and justice. If moral standing is dependent on acceptance of a sacrificial narrative, what becomes of ethical agency? Are humans accountable for their actions or merely participants in a system of preordained salvation? The psychological impact of this model is significant. Believers may internalize a sense of perpetual dependence on divine judgment, measuring their worth through adherence to prescribed beliefs and rituals rather than through conscious ethical effort. Doubt becomes a moral hazard. curiosity a potential sin. Children socialized within this framework often learn that questioning authority is inherently dangerous, fostering a culture in which fear and obedience supersede critical thought. This dynamic mirrors historical practices where loyalty to a ruler or institution was reinforced through the fear of divine or social punishment, demonstrating the enduring potency of the narrative. Historical parallels abound. Leaders from the Roman Empire to medieval monarchies leveraged religious frameworks to enforce societal order. Obedience to divine authority was equated with moral virtue, dissent with sin, and conformity with loyalty. In many cases, these systems sanctioned extreme measures, persecution, exile, and execution, justified as enforcement of ethical or spiritual standards. The alignment between religious doctrine and state power created mechanisms for control that extended beyond individual behavior to shape entire societies, illustrating the practical consequences of prioritizing belief over action. Yet, the figure of Jesus also introduces ethical complexity. His teachings, when interpreted broadly, emphasize compassion, empathy, and care for the marginalized. Parables like the Good Samaritan or the Prodigal Son highlight human responsibility to act with mercy and kindness, suggesting that ethical behavior is not entirely eclipsed by obedience. The tension lies in the dual message. Salvation and divine approval require faith and submission, yet genuine moral growth emerges from acts of empathy and justice. This duality has been central to theological debate and has influenced how religious communities negotiate the balance between faith and action. Modern ethical reflection increasingly challenges the primacy of obedience as a measure of morality. Secular frameworks and humanist philosophies emphasize personal accountability, empathy, and the consequences of one's actions rather than adherence to dogma. This approach fosters moral autonomy, allowing individuals to reason, question, and act ethically independent of inherited guilt or external authority. By contrast, a system that privileges belief and submission risks producing conformity at the expense of critical thought and moral reflection. The historical consequences of privileging obedience over ethics are evident in social and political life. Religious authorities have often wielded the threat of divine punishment to suppress dissent and enforce social hierarchies. Heretics were executed, women accused of witchcraft burned, and entire communities coerced into conformity under the banner of salvation. These actions were not anomalies, but consistent applications of a moral framework that equates loyalty to authority with virtue. The emphasis on belief over behavior created conditions in which cruelty, exclusion, and violence could be rationalized as morally necessary. Furthermore, the doctrine of salvation intertwines with notions of divine justice and human suffering. By framing virtue as a function of belief and obedience, the system externalizes moral evaluation, making divine judgment the ultimate arbiter of right and wrong. From a modern standpoint, this diminishes personal ethical responsibility and constrains the development of independent moral reasoning. It reinforces a worldview in which fear of punishment, rather than empathy or conscience, becomes the primary motivator for ethical behavior. Yet, the narrative also carries an enduring lesson. Morality cannot be fully realized through submission alone. Historical and modern experience demonstrates that genuine ethical action arises from reflective judgment, empathy, and engagement with the consequences of one's choices. When obedience becomes the measure of virtue, moral reasoning is eclipsed and the potential for abuse is magnified. Leaders, institutions, and societies that prioritize belief over ethical action risk perpetuating cycles of fear, exclusion, and control, dynamics that have shaped human history for centuries. In summary, Part 12 explores the tension between faith, salvation, and ethical action in the figure of Jesus and the broader Christian framework. The narrative emphasizes the primacy of belief and obedience, illustrating how moral authority can be externalized and used to enforce conformity. Historical leaders have leveraged these principles to maintain power and suppress dissent, while the psychological effects of inherited guilt and conditional salvation continue to influence religious communities. At the same time, Jesus' teachings provide a counterpoint, highlighting the importance of compassion, empathy, and ethical responsibility. Understanding this duality is critical for evaluating the ethical implications of obedience-based morality and the enduring influence of biblical narratives on human behavior. Throughout history, the Bible has been invoked not merely as a spiritual guide, but as a legal and moral instrument to justify actions that, by modern ethical standards, are deeply troubling. From medieval Europe to early modern colonial empires, religious authorities and political leaders frequently cited scripture to sanction war, persecution, and social hierarchies. Far from being abstract texts, these passages became living instruments of power, shaping policies, enforcing obedience, and curbing dissent. The stories within the Bible, when interpreted literally or rigidly, offered a framework that equated divine sanction with moral legitimacy, giving rulers, judges, and officials the authority to act with near absolute certainty that they were executing a just plan. Consider the Crusades, launched in the 11th century, a series of military campaigns ostensibly aimed at reclaiming the Holy Land. Leaders framed these wars as moral imperatives, arguing that the deaths of thousands, often innocents, were justified by scripture and divine will. Soldiers were promised spiritual rewards, while rulers wielded biblical texts as both motivation and moral cover for conquest. The notion that God's favor could be invoked to validate violence created a template for centuries of conflict, where ethical considerations were subordinated to perceived divine directives. The Inquisitions offer another stark illustration. Across Spain, Italy, and France, religious courts prosecuted individuals accused of heresy, often employing torture and execution. These measures were justified through scripture and theological argumentation. Dissent was equated with sin, and sin with disobedience to divine authority. In this context, morality was externally enforced, and the fear of eternal punishment reinforced social conformity. The system left little room for critical thought, empathy, or negotiation. Instead, obedience to religious law became the ultimate measure of virtue, and any deviation was treated as a moral threat. Colonial enterprises also leaned heavily on biblical justification. European powers, venturing into Africa, the Americas, and Asia, frequently cited scripture to rationalize conquest, enslavement, and forced conversion. Indigenous populations were dehumanized in theological terms, depicted as morally or spiritually inferior, and their subjugation framed as divinely ordained. The same texts that extolled mercy and compassion were selectively interpreted to endorse violence, exploitation, and the imposition of foreign cultural norms. Historical leaders wielded these narratives not only to expand territories, but to normalize hierarchical social structures that privileged Europeans over colonized peoples. Even within domestic contexts, biblical authority shaped legal and social norms in ways that enforced conformity and curtailed individual freedoms. Laws derived from scripture dictated dress codes, sexual behavior, Sabbath observance, and gender roles. Women, in particular, were constrained by interpretations of biblical passages that emphasized obedience and chastity, often at the expense of autonomy and education. The moral code, grounded in divine authority, positioned deviation not as an ethical choice, but as a sin demanding correction, often through social censure, exclusion, or legal penalties. The consequences of prioritizing scriptural obedience over ethical reflection are profound. Actions that would be condemned in secular or humanist frameworks, slavery, discrimination, corporal punishment, and persecution, were rendered morally acceptable if they aligned with interpreted divine will. The underlying principle was clear. Belief and conformity, rather than empathy or justice, were the ultimate arbiters of right and wrong. Leaders and institutions that understood this wielded enormous influence, shaping the lives of millions by controlling not only behavior but thought. In modern times, the legacy of this approach persists in subtler forms. Certain interpretations of Scripture continue to influence legislation, social policy, and cultural attitudes. Arguments against gender equality, LGBTQ+ rights, and scientific education are sometimes couched in biblical language, invoking the authority of texts written centuries ago to determine contemporary social norms. Even when explicit violence is absent, the principle remains the same. Adherence to prescribed belief and obedience to divine or institutional authority is prioritized over autonomous ethical reasoning. Psychologically, this environment reinforces internalized fear and dependence. Individuals learn to measure their worth by compliance with external standards, rather than by the quality of their actions or the consequences they produce. Critical questioning is discouraged, doubt is treated as a moral failing, and deviation is met with guilt or social sanction. Over generations, this produces a population conditioned to equate morality with obedience, diminishing the capacity for independent ethical judgment. The same mechanisms that justified historical atrocities now shape cultural and personal decision-making in more nuanced ways. Yet the Bible also contains narratives that, when interpreted with a focus on human agency and empathy, provide counterpoints to these authoritarian tendencies. Stories of mercy, forgiveness, and selfless action encourage reflection on the human capacity for ethical behavior. However, these teachings are often overshadowed by the emphasis on obedience, punishment, and divine favor. The tension between these two strands, the ethical and the authoritarian, reflects a broader struggle within religious practice. The reconciliation of compassion with control, of moral insight with institutional authority. In evaluating the historical impact of the Bible as a tool for control, it is important to recognize the interplay of text, interpretation, and power. The stories themselves provide the raw material, but human agents, the clergy, monarchs, and scholars, shape their application. The moral lessons embedded in Scripture can be invoked to inspire generosity and justice, yet the same texts have been used to legitimize cruelty, hierarchy, and coercion. The divergence lies not solely in the words, but in the lens through which they are understood and applied. Historical leaders who leveraged biblical authority often did so with strategic precision. By framing their decisions as divinely sanctioned, they minimized dissent and maximized obedience. This alignment of religious belief and political authority created a feedback loop. Fear of divine punishment reinforced loyalty to the ruler, while loyalty to the ruler reinforced fear of divine punishment. Within this system, moral reasoning independent of authority became risky, and ethical behavior was inseparable from doctrinal conformity. The implications for personal and societal development were profound, shaping cultures in ways that persist to this day. The modern ethical critique is clear. Morality grounded in fear and obedience is fundamentally limited. True ethical reasoning requires evaluation of consequences, empathy, and an understanding of human needs and rights. Systems that prioritize belief and submission over these factors risk perpetuating harm and suppressing autonomy. Historical examples, from the Inquisitions to colonial exploitation, demonstrate that obedience without ethical reflection can facilitate atrocities and sustain systemic injustice. In conclusion, Part 13 examines the ways in which the Bible has been historically mobilized to enforce obedience, justify violence, and shape social hierarchies. Leaders, institutions, and communities have repeatedly leveraged its authority to maintain power, often subordinating ethical reasoning to doctrinal fidelity. While Scripture contains narratives that encourage compassion and moral reflection, the dominant emphasis on obedience has had profound historical consequences, influencing both individual behavior and societal structures. Recognizing this duality is essential for understanding the ethical challenges posed by belief systems that equate loyalty with virtue and for navigating the enduring impact of these frameworks in the modern world. Part 14: Scripture, Social Inequality, and Cultural Conditioning. Throughout history, the Bible has not only been a religious guide, but also a social blueprint, reinforcing hierarchies, gender roles, and cultural norms. From its earliest interpretations to modern applications, Scripture has often been leveraged to justify systemic inequalities, ensuring that power remained concentrated in the hands of certain groups while others were expected to obey. These texts, when read through the lens of authority rather than ethics, provided not just spiritual direction, but societal control, subtly shaping perceptions of justice, duty, and worth. One of the clearest examples lies in the treatment of women. From the stories of Eve's disobedience to Paul's letters instructing women to submit to their husbands, Scripture has often been interpreted to place women in subordinate roles. Obedience, chastity, and domesticity are frequently emphasized as moral imperatives, while leadership, autonomy, and public agency are framed as exceptions or even transgressions. Religious authorities have historically cited these passages to regulate education, work, and personal freedom, reinforcing patriarchal structures that limited opportunities for women for centuries. These teachings not only justified inequality, but normalized it, embedding the notion that societal hierarchy reflected divine order. Slavery offers another stark example. Biblical passages, particularly from the Old Testament, describe rules for owning, buying, and selling humans. Far from condemning the practice outright, these texts provide regulations, effectively legitimizing slavery as a social institution. In colonial and antebellum societies, enslavers frequently cited these passages to defend their actions, claiming divine approval. Laws, social customs, and even economic practices were framed as consistent with God's will. Human suffering was subordinated to the interpretation of Scripture, creating a system where obedience and faith were prioritized over empathy and moral reasoning. The cultural conditioning imposed by Scripture extends beyond gender and slavery. Laws around purity, food, Sabbath observance, and ritual conduct were designed to demarcate insiders from outsiders, creating a framework of inclusion and exclusion based on adherence to religious norms. Those who failed to comply were often stigmatized, punished, or excluded, reinforcing conformity and deterring critical thought. In this way, religion served as a mechanism for social cohesion, but at a significant ethical cost. The moral worth of an individual became intertwined with obedience, while personal understanding, fairness, and compassion were secondary. Historically, leaders wielded this influence strategically. Monarchs, clergy, and legal authorities interpreted Scripture to reinforce their legitimacy. By aligning political authority with divine sanction, rulers minimized challenges to their power. Obedience was framed as both a spiritual and civic duty, creating a society in which questioning hierarchical structures was morally suspect. This alignment of divine and earthly authority generated immense stability, but it came at the cost of individual freedom and ethical autonomy. Fear of divine punishment and social reprisal became powerful tools for enforcing compliance. Colonial expansion further illustrates the use of Scripture as a tool of domination. European powers frequently depicted indigenous populations as morally or spiritually inferior, using biblical narratives to justify conquest, forced conversion, and cultural erasure. Resistance was framed as rebellion against God, while compliance was interpreted as moral virtue. The consequence was not only the subjugation of entire populations, but the internalization of these hierarchical values by both colonizers and the colonized, perpetuating inequality across generations. The modern echoes of this historical conditioning are evident in contemporary debates over gender, sexuality, and human rights. Certain religious interpretations continue to shape laws, public policy, and social norms. In some communities, women face restrictions on leadership roles, reproductive rights, and personal agency, justified through Scripture. LGBTQ+ individuals are often denied basic recognition, again under the claim that obedience to divine law trumps personal freedom. These contemporary issues demonstrate that the influence of Scripture is not confined to the past. Its impact on social attitudes and moral reasoning persists. Psychologically, the internalization of these hierarchies shapes behavior and self-perception. Individuals may feel compelled to conform to prescribed roles, experiencing guilt, shame, or fear when they diverge. Questioning authority or challenging norms is often equated with sin or moral failing, discouraging independent ethical reflection. Over time, this conditioning can generate widespread patterns of obedience and submission, reinforcing social inequalities as morally justified rather than socially constructed. Yet, within the same texts, there are moments that highlight human dignity, compassion, and justice. Prophets, parables, and ethical teachings provide avenues for reflection on fairness, mercy, and care for the vulnerable. However, these messages are often overshadowed by passages emphasizing obedience, punishment, and divine authority. The tension between these two strands, ethical guidance versus hierarchical control, reflects the complex role of Scripture in shaping culture and morality. The selective emphasis on authority over ethics has historically determined which messages endure in social practice. The interplay of Scripture, interpretation, and authority is central to understanding its societal influence. Texts are static, but human application is dynamic. Religious leaders, educators, and rulers decide which passages to emphasize and how to enforce them. When obedience and conformity are prioritized over reflection and empathy, Scripture becomes a mechanism of control rather than a guide for ethical reasoning. Conversely, when ethical principles are foregrounded, these texts can inspire compassion, justice, and social reform. The historical record shows that power often favors the former, embedding hierarchy and inequality as divinely sanctioned. Modern ethical critique highlights the dangers of this approach. Systems that prioritize obedience over moral reasoning risk perpetuating injustice, limiting autonomy, and suppressing empathy. Historical examples, slavery, gender oppression, colonial domination, illustrate the consequences of substituting ethical reflection with scriptural compliance. Even today, individuals and societies can internalize these norms, perpetuating cycles of inequality and limiting the development of a culture based on fairness, autonomy, and empathy. In conclusion, Part 14 examines how Scripture has historically reinforced social hierarchies, justified inequality, and shaped cultural conditioning. From gender roles to slavery, from colonial conquest to modern social norms, religious texts have often been interpreted to prioritize obedience over ethics. While these texts contain elements promoting compassion and justice, their selective application has frequently reinforced authority and hierarchy. Understanding this history is essential for navigating contemporary ethical challenges, as it reveals the enduring power of Scripture not only as a spiritual guide, but also as a tool of social control. One of the most enduring themes in the history of religious practice is the tension between obedience and ethical reasoning. The Bible, as a central text, repeatedly emphasizes the importance of submission to divine authority, often framing compliance as the ultimate expression of faith. Obedience is celebrated while questioning, doubt, or moral critique is depicted as dangerous or sinful. This emphasis has profound consequences, both for individuals and for the societies that interpret and enforce these mandates. Historically, blind obedience to Scripture has been used to legitimize actions that, by modern standards, are deeply unethical. Religious leaders, monarchs, and political authorities have frequently claimed that divine commands justify violence, punishment, or oppression. For example, wars conducted in the name of God, from the Crusades to colonial conquests, often relied on Scripture to frame obedience as a moral imperative. The destruction of entire cities, forced conversions, and suppression of dissent were defended as divine will rather than critically examined acts. Individuals who questioned these mandates were often branded heretics, punished, or ostracized. This pattern is not limited to distant history. Even in contemporary settings, the tension between obedience and morality can shape social and personal outcomes. Communities that prioritize doctrinal compliance over ethical reflection may perpetuate gender inequality, restrict personal freedoms, and suppress dissenting voices. Children growing up in such environments often internalize these hierarchies and limitations, learning to equate moral virtue with submission rather than with compassion or justice. Fear of divine punishment reinforces conformity, discouraging moral experimentation and critical thinking. The psychological implications of this dynamic are profound. When obedience is prioritized above moral reasoning, individuals may struggle to differentiate between ethical principles and authoritative demands. People can justify harmful actions simply because they believe them to be divinely sanctioned, even when these actions conflict with empathy or social norms. Historical examples abound, from the enslavement of people justified by selective biblical passages to the persecution of heretics, witches, or minority groups framed as upholding God's law. In each case, obedience was used to validate actions that modern society would consider morally unacceptable. Paradoxically, this emphasis on obedience also creates an ethical blind spot. Believers may develop a moral framework in which outcomes matter less than adherence to authority. Loyalty to divine commands is valorized, while harm caused by unquestioning compliance is minimized or ignored. The stories of Abraham being willing to sacrifice Isaac, Saul punished for sparing an enemy, or Lot's moral compromise illustrate this pattern. The moral worth of individuals is measured less by their actions' consequences than by their willingness to submit. Obedience becomes a moral goal in itself, often at the expense of empathy, justice, and human dignity. This dynamic also influences societal development. Civilizations that interpret Scripture as prescribing absolute obedience may resist legal reform, social justice initiatives, or scientific progress when these challenge traditional interpretations. Social hierarchies, gender roles, and punitive systems can be justified as divinely mandated, slowing societal adaptation and embedding structural inequities. Historical and modern examples, from the legal codes of religious states to policies restricting education or human rights, highlight the tangible consequences of obedience prioritized over ethical reasoning. However, it is crucial to recognize that not all religious interpretation enforces blind submission. Within Scripture, there are passages that emphasize mercy, justice, and care for the vulnerable. Prophets, parables, and ethical teachings provide a framework for moral reflection. But these passages are often overshadowed by narratives emphasizing fear, punishment, and hierarchical control. When societies emphasize obedience over ethical inquiry, these lessons of compassion are minimized, leaving a skewed moral vision that privileges authority over justice. The role of leadership in shaping obedience cannot be overstated. Clergy, educators, and political authorities have historically controlled which scriptural messages are amplified and which are suppressed. By emphasizing divine authority, fear of punishment, and the virtue of submission, leaders can create environments where moral reflection is discouraged. The result is a culture in which obedience is celebrated as piety, while independent thought is morally suspect. This not only affects religious practice, but also shapes social norms, political structures, and cultural expectations. In modern terms, the consequences of prioritizing obedience over morality are visible in debates over human rights, social justice, and ethical governance. Communities that rigidly enforce religious conformity may marginalize individuals who act according to personal moral principles rather than doctrinal rules. This can limit innovation, suppress empathy, and create cycles of fear and guilt that affect generations. Education and critical thinking often clash with obedience-based moral systems, leading to tension between religious tradition and contemporary ethical standards. From a personal perspective, individuals conditioned to equate faith with submission often struggle with autonomy. Doubt becomes a source of anxiety. Ethical reflection may be suppressed, and moral reasoning is filtered through the lens of obedience. In such contexts, fear of divine punishment and social reprisal overrides internal moral compass. The consequence is a form of moral externalization, where goodness is defined not by ethical reflection, but by adherence to authority. This dynamic can have profound implications for psychological health, interpersonal relationships, and societal engagement. Yet, awareness of this dynamic opens the door to moral autonomy. Recognizing the difference between obedience and ethical reasoning allows individuals to separate religious authority from moral action. It becomes possible to retain the cultural, spiritual, or communal aspects of religion while cultivating independent moral judgment. Historical examples of reformers, human rights activists, and progressive religious thinkers illustrate how individuals can challenge obedience-driven interpretations to promote justice, compassion, and equality. Ultimately, Part 15 emphasizes that obedience, when valued above ethical reasoning, can distort personal morality and societal development. Scripture, when interpreted primarily as a tool for submission, risks promoting harm, inequality, and fear. Yet, the same texts also contain seeds of justice and compassion, which can be cultivated when critical reflection is encouraged. The history of obedience illustrates both the power and the peril of religious authority. It can maintain order and cohesion, but it can also perpetuate injustice, limit personal freedom, and suppress ethical growth. Understanding this tension is key to navigating the moral landscape of both history and contemporary life. The Bible repeatedly illustrates a pattern of selective justice and divine favoritism, revealing a deity whose moral compass appears to favor loyalty to specific tribes or individuals over universal ethical principles. This favoritism is often portrayed as a reward for obedience, a reinforcement of hierarchy, or a mechanism to maintain power and control. The consequences of such selective moral standards resonate throughout both historical and modern contexts, shaping societies and influencing how humans interpret fairness, justice, and divine authority. Historically, favoritism is exemplified in the covenant with the Israelites. The biblical narrative frames this selection as a mark of divine love and protection, yet it simultaneously establishes exclusivity. The chosen tribe receives blessings, victories, and protection, while other nations are punished, conquered, or annihilated. This creates a moral framework in which loyalty to God and tribal identity determines the value of human life. It is a system in which morality is conditional, dependent not on intrinsic ethical conduct, but on allegiance to a chosen group. Such a framework has echoes in human history. Empires and kingdoms often justified conquest, slavery, and subjugation as divinely mandated, believing that divine favor conferred moral authority. Leaders like Constantine, Charlemagne, or even the Spanish conquistadors drew upon biblical narratives to assert that their victories and territorial claims were morally sanctioned by God. The consequences of selective justice extend beyond warfare and politics. They also permeate societal norms and individual behavior. When Scripture emphasizes divine favoritism, it implicitly teaches that some lives are inherently more valuable than others. This creates moral hierarchies that can justify inequality, discrimination, and exclusion. Historically, this has been used to rationalize the enslavement of African peoples, the subjugation of women, and the persecution of religious minorities. Even today, selective interpretation of Scripture can reinforce systemic injustices, from gender inequality to restrictions on education, white reproductive rights, or freedom of belief. In the narratives of kings and prophets, favoritism is often intertwined with testing, reward, and punishment. Figures like David, Joseph, and Solomon are portrayed as recipients of divine blessing because of obedience or chosen status, while their enemies suffer severe consequences. Such stories suggest a moral universe where fairness is subordinate to divine whim and allegiance. This challenges contemporary ethical standards, which prioritize justice, equality, and the intrinsic worth of individuals, independent of tribal or religious affiliation. When divine favor dictates moral value, human life is reduced to a reflection of obedience rather than a measure of inherent dignity. The psychology of divine favoritism is also striking. Believers are conditioned to see success as a reflection of righteousness and failure as punishment. Prosperity and power become markers of moral worth, while suffering may be interpreted as divine disfavor. This encourages both hubris and guilt, depending on one's position within the favored hierarchy. Leaders can exploit this psychology, reinforcing obedience and fear while suppressing dissent. It is a dynamic visible not only in ancient empires, but also in modern communities that interpret material success or social status as indicators of divine approval. Tribal morality, as portrayed in the Bible, amplifies the consequences of selective justice. Moral laws are often framed around the preservation of the chosen people, rather than universal principles of ethical behavior. The command to exterminate entire populations, erase cultural identities, or enforce strict loyalty reflects a morality designed for survival and dominance, rather than compassion or fairness. Such tribal morality resonates with patterns seen in human history: in-group favoritism, exclusion of outsiders, and justifications for conquest. Leaders across civilizations have mirrored this pattern, portraying their political or military victories as divinely ordained and morally righteous, irrespective of the human cost. Modern parallels can be drawn in political, social, and religious contexts. Groups that interpret divine favor literally may enforce strict adherence to in-group norms while marginalizing those outside the community. This can manifest as discrimination, social ostracization, or even violence against perceived outsiders. The biblical precedent of selective justice continues to influence contemporary ethical debates, raising questions about equity, moral responsibility, and the universality of human rights. Understanding the historical roots of this mindset allows us to see how ideas of divine favoritism have shaped and continue to shape societal norms and individual behavior. The tension between divine favoritism and universal ethics is further complicated by human interpretation. While the Bible presents favoritism as an expression of divine will, human leaders often amplify or distort these narratives to serve political or social agendas. The selective application of justice becomes a tool for maintaining control, legitimizing authority, and enforcing conformity. For example, the endorsement of slavery in the antebellum United States, or the justification of gender hierarchies in certain religious communities, draws upon selective biblical passages to assert that some groups are morally favored while others are inherently subordinate. The danger is that moral judgment becomes contingent upon allegiance rather than reason, compassion, or justice. Yet, there is also evidence of subversive interpretation and moral questioning within Scripture. Prophets, reformers, and thinkers challenge favoritism, emphasizing mercy, justice, and care for the vulnerable. These counter-narratives reveal the tension between obedience-driven morality and ethical reasoning. They demonstrate that selective justice is not inevitable. It is reinforced by human interpretation, leadership, and societal structures. By studying these tensions, we can understand how religious texts influence both oppression and reform, highlighting the critical role of interpretation in shaping moral outcomes. In examining favoritism and tribal morality, it becomes clear that moral lessons cannot be extracted from Scripture without critical reflection. Obedience, privilege, and divine selection are often entangled with social power and historical context. Understanding the selective nature of biblical justice allows individuals to separate ethical principles from hierarchical mandates, fostering a morality grounded in empathy, fairness, and universal human dignity. This approach encourages a more nuanced engagement with Scripture, one that recognizes historical context while promoting ethical autonomy. Ultimately, Part 16 emphasizes that selective justice and divine favoritism in the Bible provide a framework for understanding both historical and contemporary moral dynamics. By highlighting favoritism, punishment, and in-group morality, the narratives shape societies, influence leadership, and condition individual behavior. The stories underscore the dangers of equating divine favor with ethical worth, revealing a moral system that prioritizes loyalty and submission over compassion and justice. Understanding this pattern allows us to critically assess historical actions, contemporary social norms, and personal ethical reasoning, ultimately fostering a more reflective and equitable approach to morality. Fear is one of the most powerful motivators in human behavior, and the Bible repeatedly employs it as a tool to ensure compliance and devotion. From the stories of divine wrath to explicit threats of eternal punishment, fear-based obedience is presented as a fundamental mechanism by which humans are guided or coerced into following God's commands. This approach is not unique to religion. Throughout history, leaders and governments have leveraged fear to control populations. But the biblical model intertwines spiritual, moral, and social authority in a way that magnifies its effects. Consider the recurring motif of punishment for disobedience in Scripture. Violations of divine law are met not only with reprimand, but with immediate, often extreme consequences. The stoning of individuals for minor infractions, the destruction of cities for moral transgressions, and the repeated reminders of hell and eternal suffering for disbelief instill a pervasive sense of dread. By framing fear as a necessary condition for morality, the text cultivates a mindset where compliance is inseparable from spiritual survival. Disobedience is not merely a moral failing, it is existentially dangerous. Historically, the impact of fear-driven obedience is evident in societies heavily influenced by biblical law. Leaders who claimed divine sanction could enforce harsh codes of conduct, confident that religious authority would compel compliance. Monarchs, judges, and local authorities often cited Scripture to justify executions, corporal punishment, and harsh governance. Fear of divine retribution amplified the reach of these human laws, as people internalized the belief that disobedience could incur not only social or legal consequences, but eternal damnation. The psychological impact was profound. Generations grew up equating morality with fear, obedience with righteousness, and doubt with sin. The consequences of this fear extend beyond mere compliance. It shapes ethical reasoning, moral judgment, and interpersonal behavior. A society conditioned by fear may suppress questioning, innovation, and dissent. Individuals may internalize a rigid moral framework, prioritizing survival and approval over independent ethical deliberation. The result is often a population that accepts hierarchy and authority unquestioningly, even when it conflicts with empathy, fairness, or reason. In extreme cases, this can justify atrocities, as people rationalize violence and oppression as divine will. Historical examples include the Crusades, Inquisitions, and witch trials, where fear of divine punishment combined with political authority to produce catastrophic social outcomes. Fear-based obedience also influences modern leadership and governance, particularly in societies where religious law intersects with civil law. Leaders who present themselves as instruments of divine will may exploit the fear of punishment, both spiritual and social, to consolidate power. This can manifest in restrictive laws, censorship, and coercive social norms, often targeting vulnerable populations. Children, in particular, are especially susceptible, as early indoctrination creates deeply ingrained associations between fear, morality, and authority. This, psy- this psychological conditioning can persist throughout life, shaping attitudes toward law governance and interpersonal relationships. The stories of fear driven obedience in the Bible often involve extreme tests of loyalty. Abraham's near sacrifice of Isaac, the trials of Job, and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah exemplify a system where humans are subjected to suffering as proof of faith. These narratives convey that fear and suffering are integral to moral development, or, more accurately, that compliance under threat is the ultimate moral virtue. Such framing has profound psychological implications. Morality becomes measured by submission rather than understanding, resilience rather than justice, and fear rather than compassion. Critically, this system of fear undermines autonomous ethical reasoning. When obedience is motivated by terror, individuals may comply with commands that are otherwise morally indefensible. Historical parallels abound. Soldiers following orders that result in mass atrocities, civilians endorsing discriminatory policies, and communities participating in persecution or punishment under the justification of divine mandate. The biblical precedent thus illustrates not only the power of fear in guiding behavior, but also the risks of conflating moral rightness with enforced submission. The interplay between fear and reward is also central. Scripture often promises blessings, prosperity, and protection to those who obey, reinforcing the behavioral incentive structure. The promise of reward complements the threat of punishment, creating a dual mechanism that conditions behavior through both hope and fear. Leaders, empires, and religious institutions throughout history have replicated this dual strategy, emphasizing both the dangers of disobedience and the benefits of compliance. The effectiveness of such a system lies in its psychological impact. Moral and social behavior is continuously regulated, not by reflection or empathy, but by anticipation of consequences. In modern contexts, fear-based morality persists in subtle forms. Religious communities that stress hell, divine wrath, or eternal punishment cultivate environments where questioning and dissent are discouraged. Social and cultural reinforcement further strengthens these norms, as communal approval, social status, and belonging are tied to adherence. This creates a feedback loop in which obedience is valorized, doubt is stigmatized, and moral development is constrained by the need for security and acceptance. The effects ripple across generations, influencing societal attitudes toward authority, justice, and ethical responsibility. At the individual level, fear-based obedience can distort emotional and cognitive development. People may struggle to differentiate between genuine ethical insight and learned compliance. Empathy may be suppressed if it conflicts with mandated behavior. Critical thinking may be stifled, and self-expression may be limited by the constant need to align with perceived divine expectations. Children raised in these environments may internalize guilt, shame, and anxiety, carrying these emotional patterns into adulthood. Psychologists have observed that early experiences of authoritarian control, particularly when framed in spiritual or moral terms, have long-lasting effects on self-concept, decision-making, and moral judgment. Yet, the Bible also presents moments of resistance, moral questioning, and critique of fear-based obedience. Prophets challenge leaders, call out injustices, and emphasize mercy and compassion over rigid compliance. These narratives reveal an alternative moral framework, one grounded in ethical reasoning rather than fear. They demonstrate that obedience is not the sole measure of righteousness and that genuine morality requires reflection, empathy, and courage. The tension between fear-based compliance and ethical autonomy underscores the complexity of biblical morality, illustrating both the dangers of coercive authority and the potential for moral insight and reform. In conclusion, Part 17 emphasizes that fear-based obedience is a central mechanism in biblical narratives, shaping both historical and modern social structures, influencing individual psychology and conditioning ethical reasoning. The use of fear as a motivator has profound consequences. It reinforces hierarchy, suppresses critical thought, and justifies actions that would otherwise be morally indefensible. By understanding the dynamics of fear in these narratives, we gain insight into the historical use of religious authority, the psychological conditioning of populations, and the enduring influence of fear-based morality in contemporary societies. Recognizing these patterns allows us to separate ethical principles from coercive mechanisms, fostering a morality rooted in empathy, reason, and universal human dignity, rather than submission and terror. One of the most enduring and psychologically impactful concepts in biblical theology is the idea of inherited guilt, most famously expressed through the doctrine of original sin. According to this framework, humanity is born not neutral but culpable, burdened by the transgressions of an ancestor, Adam, in the biblical narrative. This notion places every human being, from birth, in a moral deficit that must be acknowledged, atoned for, and ultimately forgiven. Unlike typical legal systems, where guilt is assigned based on individual action, original sin constructs a reality where the very act of being born carries moral consequences. This is a striking departure from any modern understanding of justice, yet it has profoundly shaped ethical thought, religious practice, and social conditioning for centuries. The psychological impact of this doctrine is immediate and profound. From infancy, humans are framed as fundamentally flawed, with their natural impulses, desires, and even innocence cast as morally problematic. The first act of humanity, the consumption of forbidden fruit, is not merely historical allegory, but becomes a template for human weakness, a justification for authority, and a source of guilt imposed upon each generation. This inherited moral liability has far-reaching effects, instilling feelings of shame, inadequacy, and dependence on divine or ecclesiastical authority for redemption. Parents, religious teachers, and communities often reinforce these notions, ensuring that each generation internalizes the lesson. Humanity is flawed by default and must seek salvation through prescribed rituals, obedience, and belief. Historically, the concept of inherited guilt has been leveraged to maintain control and consolidate authority. Clergy and religious leaders have emphasized the necessity of baptism, confession, and penance, framing these acts as essential not merely for spiritual growth, but for escaping the inherited condemnation imposed on every human being. Monarchs and political authorities aligned with religious institutions often reinforce this framework, legitimizing laws and social hierarchies through appeals to divine justice and collective moral debt. The concept that guilt is not personal but inherited allowed rulers and religious authorities to demand obedience and submission across entire populations, presenting compliance as the only path to moral and spiritual safety. This dynamic has had significant consequences for individual morality and societal development. When guilt is inherited, moral evaluation shifts from actions to identity. People are taught to judge themselves and others not solely by behavior, but by their inherent state, creating an environment where fear, shame, and ritual observance overshadow genuine ethical reasoning. This framework also encourages externalization of responsibility, as the emphasis moves from personal reflection to adherence to prescribed remedies for an inherited problem. Actions like prayer, confession, or ritual observance become proxies for ethical understanding, often replacing critical reflection, empathy, and practical moral engagement. The consequences extend to social justice and cultural development. Societies influenced by the doctrine of original sin often accept hierarchical structures as morally justified. Inequalities, suffering, and social stratification can be interpreted as consequences of inherited moral deficiency rather than structural failings. Those in positions of authority, religious or secular, may be seen as morally equipped to guide, correct, and punish, while the masses are presumed to be fundamentally flawed and in need of oversight. This creates a feedback loop in which moral authority is concentrated at the top, obedience is enforced by fear of inherited guilt, and critical evaluation of leaders or institutions is discouraged as both dangerous and morally suspect. In modern terms, the psychological burden of inherited guilt manifests in anxiety, low self-esteem, and an external locus of moral control. Individuals raised under the weight of original sin may struggle to distinguish personal responsibility from inherited moral deficiency. They may experience chronic fear of judgment, perfectionism, and a heightened need for approval from authority figures. This can affect interpersonal relationships, creativity, and ethical decision-making, as moral courage is often subordinated to ritual compliance or fear-driven obedience. The doctrine effectively trains generations to prioritize salvation over moral reasoning, instilling a worldview where freedom, curiosity, and independent ethical evaluation are constrained by the weight of collective punishment. Biblical narratives reinforce this framework through examples of collective punishment and inherited consequences. The descendants of Adam and Eve inherit sin. The people of Sodom and Gomorrah are punished en masse for communal transgressions. And even entire nations, in various stories, bear the moral burden of their ancestors' choices. These examples communicate that guilt is not solely individual, but transferable, that consequences can extend across time and space, and that humans exist in a moral ecosystem where punishment and reward are distributed collectively rather than individually. This collective orientation contrasts sharply with modern ethics, which emphasizes personal responsibility, proportional justice, and the rights of the innocent. Historical and modern leaders alike have mirrored these principles in governance and law. Authoritarian regimes, whether secular or religiously infused, often operate on the assumption that collective responsibility justifies punishment or control. Children, families, and communities can be held accountable for the perceived sins or failures of their predecessors. In some cases, this logic has justified intergenerational oppression, systemic inequality, and targeted persecution. The biblical model of inherited guilt thus provides a potent example of how religious doctrines can shape societal structures and influence cultural attitudes toward justice and morality. Yet, the biblical text also presents opportunities for resistance, reflection, and ethical evolution. Prophetic voices and reformist narratives often challenge the notion that inherited guilt absolves individuals of moral agency, or that collective punishment is inherently just. They suggest that mercy, personal accountability, and ethical reasoning can override rigid interpretations of inherited sin. These threads remind readers that morality is not a fixed inheritance, but a dynamic engagement with justice, empathy, and understanding. They hint at an alternative paradigm in which human beings are judged not by the sins of ancestors, but by their own choices and actions, a principle that underpins modern conceptions of fairness and justice. In conclusion, Part 18 illustrates the profound influence of inherited guilt and the doctrine of original sin on personal psychology, societal organization, and ethical reasoning. By framing humanity as morally flawed from birth and emphasizing collective punishment, these biblical concepts shape behavior, reinforce authority, and limit independent moral thought. Historical and modern societies have reflected these patterns, creating structures in which fear, obedience, and ritual compliance are prioritized over critical reasoning and ethical autonomy. Recognizing these dynamics allows us to disentangle morality from inherited fear, promoting a system of ethics grounded in empathy, responsibility, and rational deliberation, rather than ancestral guilt or coercive authority. Throughout history, sacred texts have often been wielded as instruments of power, their narratives interpreted or misinterpreted to justify actions ranging from governance to warfare. The Bible, with its rich tapestry of stories, laws, and moral codes, has been no exception. While some passages promote compassion, mercy, and justice, others have been invoked to sanction violence, maintain hierarchies, and control populations. The selective application of Scripture transforms divine words into a tool of authority, allowing leaders to claim legitimacy while suppressing dissent. This weaponization of sacred texts has profoundly shaped societies, influencing laws, social norms, and cultural attitudes for millennia. Consider historical examples. Monarchs and emperors often aligned themselves with divine authority, claiming that their rule was sanctioned by God. Kings of Europe, from the medieval period onward, asserted the divine right of kings, a concept deeply intertwined with biblical narratives. By invoking Scripture, rulers not only legitimized their authority, but also established a moral framework in which obedience was equated with righteousness. Challenges to authority became not merely political acts, but sins against God. The intertwining of religious doctrine and political power created an environment where questioning leadership was framed as both heresy and rebellion, discouraging independent thought and reinforcing hierarchical structures. The Bible's narratives provided fertile ground for such interpretations. Stories of obedience rewarded and disobedience punished offered clear templates for authority and control. Abraham's unquestioning compliance, Job's suffering as a test, and the Israelites' strict adherence to divine law exemplify patterns that leaders could and did mirror. These narratives emphasize loyalty, submission, and fear as moral virtues, often overshadowing compassion, justice, and ethical reasoning. Leaders, scholars, and clergy could thus point to sacred texts as evidence that strict control and punishment were not only necessary but divinely mandated. The weaponization of Scripture extends beyond political authority into social and cultural domains. Throughout history, laws concerning slavery, gender roles, and social hierarchy have frequently been justified with biblical authority. Verses regulating the treatment of slaves, prescribing women's subordination, or sanctioning violence were not merely historical curiosities. They were active tools in shaping societal norms and reinforcing systemic inequality. In many instances, religious texts were cited to justify oppression, from colonial-era slavery to patriarchal legal codes, and even to exclude marginalized groups from rights and privileges. By framing these injustices as divinely ordained, communities could avoid ethical scrutiny, attributing harm to divine will rather than human agency. The consequences of this manipulation are not confined to the past. In modern contexts, selective readings of Scripture continue to influence social policy, lawmaking, and cultural attitudes. Religious texts are cited in debates over women's rights, LGBTQ+ equality, reproductive freedoms, and education, often as a moral justification for limiting autonomy. By appealing to divine authority, individuals and institutions can position themselves as defenders of a higher moral order, while dissenters are labeled immoral, sinful, or irreligious. This dynamic reflects the same mechanisms seen in historical contexts. Obedience and conformity are valued above critical reasoning, and fear of divine punishment reinforces social control. The moral and psychological implications are profound. When sacred texts are weaponized, morality becomes externally imposed rather than internally cultivated. Individuals are encouraged to prioritize adherence to rules and authority over ethical reflection and empathy. Questioning, curiosity, and independent judgment are framed as dangerous, while obedience and conformity are celebrated. This fosters a culture of fear and compliance, where ethical thinking is subordinated to doctrinal fidelity. Over time, these patterns become internalized, shaping individual conscience, social norms, and collective behavior. Historical leaders offer striking examples of how these dynamics manifest in governance and warfare. Monarchs and emperors frequently justified conquest, colonization, and punishment of dissenting populations through religious rhetoric. Religious leaders, in turn, wielded scriptural authority to endorse policies and actions that reinforced social hierarchies and maintained their own power. In many cases, the same texts that promoted compassion and justice were ignored, while those permitting violence and control were emphasized. This selective interpretation illustrates the malleability of Scripture as a tool. The same words could inspire charity and mercy, or justify cruelty and oppression, depending on the priorities of those in power. Modern leaders, too, reflect this pattern, though often in subtler ways. Political figures invoke religious principles to influence legislation, mobilize support, or legitimize policies. Appeals to divine authority can shape public perception, framing complex social issues as moral absolutes rather than matters for nuanced debate. In such contexts, Scripture functions as a weaponized symbol of legitimacy, a means to align personal or political objectives with the perception of a higher moral order. The effects mirror historical consequences. Obedience is valorized, dissent is stigmatized, and power is reinforced through appeals to divine sanction. The consequences extend beyond political and legal structures into everyday life. Social norms, community expectations, and family dynamics are shaped by interpretations of sacred texts. Parents, teachers, and religious leaders reinforce rules and moral codes derived from Scripture, often emphasizing obedience and submission over critical thinking and ethical reasoning. Children grow up learning that questioning authority is dangerous or sinful, that conformity is virtuous, and that fear of punishment, divine or social, is an appropriate guide for behavior. This environment perpetuates cycles of compliance and moral conditioning across generations, echoing the lessons of original sin and inherited guilt. Yet even within the biblical narrative, there are counterpoints, moments of moral reflection, and calls to justice. Prophetic voices challenge injustice, advocate mercy, and criticize unthinking adherence to ritual. These elements suggest that Scripture contains within it both tools of control and pathways to ethical reflection. The challenge lies in interpretation. When texts are approached with a critical eye, they can inspire compassion, fairness, and moral responsibility. When weaponized, they enforce fear, hierarchy, and obedience. The duality underscores the responsibility of readers, communities, and leaders in shaping how sacred texts influence society. Ultimately, Part 19 illustrates the enduring power of Scripture as both a guide and a tool of authority. The Bible's narratives have been, and continue to be, invoked to justify systemic oppression, control, and violence. By emphasizing obedience, submission, and fear over ethical reasoning and empathy, leaders have weaponized divine authority to maintain power, regulate society, and influence culture. The patterns are evident across history and into modernity, from monarchs and clerics to contemporary political and social leaders. Recognizing this dynamic is essential. Understanding how sacred texts have been used to control and manipulate allows societies and individuals to reclaim moral reasoning, ethical autonomy, and critical engagement. The lessons are clear. Morality should not be determined solely by authority, tradition, or fear. Ethics emerge from empathy, reason, and reflection. Justice requires scrutiny, accountability, and proportionality. When sacred texts are wielded as weapons, they distort these principles, substituting fear and obedience for genuine moral insight. By disentangling divine instruction from authoritarian exploitation, humanity can learn to honor ethical principles without being subjugated to inherited guilt, ritual compliance, or the fear of punishment. As we reach the culmination of this exploration, one truth stands out with stark clarity. The God portrayed in the Bible, when stripped of reverence, ritual, and centuries of interpretive layering, emerges as a figure more concerned with obedience than justice, control than compassion, fear than understanding. Across millennia, the narratives we have examined, from Noah's flood to Abraham's near sacrifice, from the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah to the intricate laws regulating human behavior, paint a picture of a being who prioritizes submission over ethical reasoning, who rewards loyalty rather than goodness, and who often punishes the innocent in ways no modern standard could justify. This is not simply historical curiosity. It is a lens through which we can examine the roots of moral conditioning, cultural practices, and even modern governance influenced by the interplay of religion and authority. Understanding this dynamic is crucial. When obedience is valued above moral reasoning, societies risk normalizing cruelty, rationalizing inequality, and perpetuating cycles of fear. When the sacred is used as a shield for power, questioning is cast as rebellion and dissent as sin. From the monarchs and clergy of history to modern political leaders who selectively invoke Scripture to legitimize laws or social norms, we see a consistent pattern: divine authority wielded as a tool for control. And yet, awareness offers liberation. Recognizing the human projection embedded within these texts allows us to separate ethical insight from authoritarian manipulation. Morality is not the exclusive domain of the divine. It is an emergent property of empathy, reflection, and shared human experience. Equally important is the recognition that these stories, despite their historical context, continue to influence people today. Children raised in environments that emphasize fear, guilt, and unquestioning obedience internalize these dynamics, often carrying them into adulthood. Social pressures, cultural norms, and religious expectations reinforce the same principles. Obedience is virtue, submission is sacred, and independent thought is suspect. The consequences are profound. Entire generations can be conditioned to accept moral paradoxes, justify harm, and suppress curiosity and critical reasoning. The echo of these ancient narratives resonates in modern debates over rights, freedoms, and societal norms. But there is agency. As viewers, as thinkers, as members of communities, we are not powerless. The ability to question, to analyze, to critically evaluate moral claims, whether derived from scripture, tradition, or authority, is a cornerstone of ethical life. By engaging with these stories honestly, without the veil of unquestioned devotion, we can extract lessons of compassion and justice while rejecting fear-driven morality. We can recognize patterns of control, disentangle morality from authoritarian imposition, and cultivate ethical frameworks based on reason, empathy, and proportionality. This does not require discarding all spiritual or religious inquiry. It requires thoughtful engagement and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. Consider the broader implications. Societies that unquestioningly enforce obedience risk stagnation, oppression, and injustice. Those that foster critical engagement, dialogue, and reflection cultivate innovation, fairness, and collective well-being. The difference lies not in the presence of sacred texts, but in the interpretive lens through which they are read. When authority is unquestioned, morality becomes a tool of compliance. When reasoning is valued, morality becomes a practice of understanding, compassion, and ethical responsibility. In this sense, the critique of the God of the Bible is not a denial of spirituality or morality. It is an invitation to reclaim moral agency from the mechanisms of fear and obedience. This is a call to action for viewers. Question the stories you were taught. Examine the assumptions embedded in tradition and consider how they have shaped your understanding of right and wrong. Engage with history honestly, acknowledging both the context and the consequences of religious narratives. Reflect on how authority, divine, political, or cultural, has influenced the moral frameworks you live by. Seek empathy and reason as guides for ethical behavior rather than fear or compulsion. Encourage dialogue, nurture curiosity, and model moral reasoning in your communities. By doing so, you participate in a legacy of ethical evolution that prioritizes understanding and care over submission and control. The ultimate takeaway is this: morality is not defined by fear of punishment or promises of reward, but by our capacity to recognize harm, act with compassion, and pursue justice. By disentangling ethical insight from authoritarian structures, we reclaim the power to think critically, act responsibly, and live authentically. The God of the Bible, as historically depicted, does not serve as a reliable moral compass. The lessons worth internalizing are those that encourage reasoning, empathy, and courageous questioning. The future of ethical societies depends not on unquestioned devotion, but on thoughtful engagement and moral courage. So take this opportunity to examine your beliefs, question assumptions, and engage with stories critically. Share these reflections with others, foster dialogue, and encourage critical thinking in your family, community, and social circles. Recognize that morality is a human endeavor, built on understanding, empathy, and collective responsibility, not on fear, obedience, or inherited guilt. The journey does not end with knowledge, it begins with action. Challenge fear-based narratives, advocate for ethical reasoning, and model compassion in your daily life. Let the stories of history inform your moral choices without enslaving your conscience. By doing so, you honor the spirit of ethical inquiry and reclaim the human capacity for justice and empathy. This is the true measure of moral progress: the ability to think independently, act compassionately, and uphold justice without reliance on fear, coercion, or blind obedience. Question, reflect, act, share, live.